If there's going to be a discussion about the bioethical principles, it helps to have some grounding in what the kind of science and logistics of the project actually are. And that really is what I see my job to be, is to give you a kind of overview of what we're doing. And I will, at the end, raise what I think are some of the kinds of questions that come up, but I'll make no effort to answer them. I'll just provide you a little bit of the scientific background that I hope will inform the conversation. Oops. Okay. Well, as a starting point, the Alabama Genomic Health Initiative is a collaborative study between UAB and Hudson Alpha Institute for Biotechnology. Those not familiar, Hudson Alpha is a private biotechnology center in Huntsville, an hour and a half or so north of here. And we have had for a while an ongoing collaboration in a Center for Genomic Medicine that I co-direct with the CEO at Hudson Alpha. This is a state-supported project. We have received $2 million per year for the last 3 years. We're hoping that this will be a 5-year project at least. And as you'll see, it's moved along pretty briskly, and the hope is that the value of this will increasingly become apparent to the community. The kind of big picture goals are to perform genomic analysis in 10,000 individuals in the state over the course of this 5 years, and I'll show you details about what we're looking at in just a moment. We do return clinical data, which is really the crux of some of the discussions I think we'll be having here today, and there is a research database and biobank that has been established using the samples and the participation of individuals in the program. There are two separate groups of people who are being enrolled in the AGHI, and we call one the population cohort and the other, for lack of a better word, the affected cohort. And what we mean by that is population cohort are simply adult volunteers. They're not selected for any particular medical issue or concern. They're just adults who are willing to participate in the study. They are recruited from a variety of places, sometimes outside clinics. There's a fair amount of outreach into the community, but we're not targeting any particular thing like cancer or heart disease, even though those are some of the kinds of things that, as you'll see, we're returning back to participants. They all get genomic analysis using a microarray called the Global Screening Array. And without going into great technical detail, it is a platform that has about 700,000 or so genetic variants kind of burned into it, so to speak. And it allows you to take a DNA sample from a participant and query that sample for the genetic composition at any one of those 700,000 or so variants. Now, the variants were selected, not by us really, more by the company that builds it, in part to cover a source of so-called medically actionable genetic variants, and I'll show you what those are in a moment, as well as a lot of other things that can be used on a more research basis. But it has some, but not complete coverage of things that are of medical interest. I'll tell you a little bit more about the return of results in genetic counseling in just a moment. Now, the affected cohort are children and adults who have medical problems that some have attributed to a possible genetic cause, but where the underlying cause has not been identified. Usually these are people who for a long time have sought medical attention for complex of various signs and symptoms where there was a suspicion that there may be an underlying genetic basis, but standard genetic testing had been unrevealing in terms of giving an answer. These usually are people who have been searching sometimes for years, even decades, for diagnosis. And they have whole genome sequencing done at Hudson Alpha, looking at all 22,000 genes, hoping to find a variant that explains the basis of their condition. Everybody is offered the possibility of participating in a DNA bank. DNA from their blood samples is stored if they give permission to do that. And there is also the possibility of data from their electronic health record if they're UAB patients, which not all are, but if they are, to be also stored in a database so that there can be future studies, research studies, linking information from their genotype back to their medical history. This is, as of this last few weeks, our enrollment. This is broken down by race and ethnicity. We have really not done as well as we would hope to do in the African American population, or for that matter, in the Hispanic and Latino population. I'll explain a little bit later what we're doing to try to address this. I should point out, this was the population cohort. This is the affected cohort, where there's a little bit larger participation from individuals historically underrepresented in biomedical research, and probably the reason is that they're identified on the basis of some kind of medical issue, which we tend to see individuals of all backgrounds in our clinics, and as a consequence, this probably closer reflects the demographics of individuals seen in the clinic. This is our current population enrollment as a function of counties in the state. And as you can see, there's only one county so far uncovered, and there's a clinic that has actually been established in that area now, with the hope that we'll be able to completely fill in the map of the state. As of, I guess, just last week, there were 4,374 participants in the population cohort, all but one of the counties in the state. And I'll show you in just a moment the kind of information that we returned, but there were 60 actionable results. It comes out to be 1.4% of the population. So here is a list, which I'm sure can't be read from back in the room, but try to give you at least a conceptual overview of what this list is, how it was put together, and what happens here with information on this list. So it's a list of genes that are returned, and these are derived from a list put together by the American College of Medical Genetics and Genomics as medically actionable traits. Now, what that means is that an individual who is found to have a specific genetic variant in any of these genes is known to be at increased risk of some kind of medical condition for which there is intervention that can lead to a better outcome. Most of these are either cancer predisposition. I guess this pointer doesn't work very well on the screen, but at the top, things that predispose to various forms of cancer. I think probably one of the better known one would be the BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutations associated with hereditary breast and ovarian cancer. An individual who might or might not know that they're at risk. They might, if they either personally have had cancer or there's a person in their family who has been afflicted with one of those kinds of cancers, but they might not have a known family history. Their families might be relatively small, for example, and at a younger age, they might not have developed cancer, yet they can be determined to carry a risk, which is substantial, upwards of 80% for some of the gene variants, and where there's intervention that can range from surveillance to allow for early detection, through chemo prevention in some cases, or surgery to reduce that risk. And there's known risk then to a family member who would be at risk of inheriting that variant, who also can be offered those same options. There is a group of connective tissue disorders. These are disorders that lead to unexpected sudden dissection of major vessels and actually can cause sudden death as a consequence of hemorrhage. There are a variety of cardiovascular disorders that either cause cardiomyopathy, a failure of the heart muscle, or arrhythmia, sudden unexpected disorder of heart rhythm. Sometimes that can present also as sudden death. Just a few metabolic conditions, mostly hypercholesterolemia, and one so-called pharmacogenetic variant. This is a variant or a set of variants that predispose to malignant hyperthermia, an adverse reaction to specific combinations of anesthetics that can be avoided by not using those anesthetics. So I know you can't read this well, but what's shown in red are the genes for which variants have been returned to individuals in this about 2 years or so since enrollment began in AGHI. Several of these are cancer predisposition syndromes. It turns out some of these people knew they were at risk, and there's probably a bias towards people who are suspicious about their risk actually being interested in participating in this project to begin with. Others had no idea that there was risk to themselves or members of their family. We haven't had any in the connective tissue disorder category. We've had a few in the cardiac, ranging from people, in one case, somebody had already had a heart transplant, to others who have no signs or symptoms nor family history of cardiovascular disease, which is an important point that I'll return to in a moment. We've had a few with hypercholesterolemia. These people knew they had hypercholesterolemia. It's pretty easy to test blood cholesterol. What they didn't know is why, and they didn't know the risk to family members other than having been tested now at the genetic level. We've had many who have had risk of this malignant hyperthermia reaction. None has ever experienced that, but now they know that they would be at risk if they should ever have surgery. Along the way, when the data are analyzed, the genetic counseling team reviews a questionnaire that everybody fills out about their family history for the same kinds of conditions that were on that list. And they get a letter back regardless of their results. So if their result indicates a variant, they'll actually get a call from a genetic counselor, a free genetic counseling visit, and then assistance in being connected with appropriate medical care, as well as ability to report this to other members of their family. If no actionable variants are found, they get a letter which says that the result was non-informative. But our genetic counseling team also reviews the questionnaire for signs of a family history that might be indicative of risk. And they get either of these three actions. One is that the family history has signs in it that are suggestive of the possibility of a genetic predisposition, in which case they're encouraged to make an appointment for a clinical genetic counseling session. That's the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, no red flags were noticed, and they get a note that just says that there still could be things that we're not picking up, but no particular warning signs were seen. And there are some in the middle, not that many, where there's things in the family history that are suspicious but not diagnostic. So our return of results rate has been about 1.4%, which is exactly where we thought it would be. That is, we estimated between 1 and 3% of individuals would have a pathogenic or likely pathogenic variant in any of the genes that were shown and would get return of results. So things are turning out to be about where we predicted they would be. And I'll come back to a couple of important points to set the stage for the bioethical discussion in a few minutes. We have now over 14,000 samples of plasma, since there could be multiple samples per participant in the biobank, large number of DNA specimens, a lot of genomic data. Probably the most important point to make is 92% of individuals will opt in to having their data included in the database and their samples stored in the biobank. So a really high rate of interest in participation. This is showing the same thing, the consent to biobank on the right. When an individual signs up, they're asked if they want the data that are collected about actionable variants to be shared with their primary care physician. And actually more than half actually say that they would not want that to be done, which at the beginning I think surprised us a little bit. But when you think about it, what really was going on here is people wanted to hear the data about themselves first. They wanted to have control of where that information is shared, and not to automatically share it with a primary care doctor or anybody else. Once a positive result is returned, there is an effort made to help them connect with a health provider who can help them deal with whatever that risk might be. And I think most of those individuals, hopefully most if not all, are getting connected to appropriate health care. But they wanted to have control of the information before any decision was made about whom to share it with, is at least my interpretation of that. This is the demographics. I guess we have 2 people over 90 years of age and a handful that are in the kind of lowest age of enrollment, which is 18 to 19. You notice that the peak is in the 50s. What we're hearing anecdotally is a lot of people are interested in this more for their families than for themselves individually. From the affected cohort, who have whole genome sequencing at this moment, or last week actually, over 300 individuals had enrolled for whole genome sequencing. That's not 300 affected individuals. It's actually 142. And we tend to enroll both parents as well as the affected person. And the reason for that is there are things you can interpret better about a person if you can see whether they inherited it from their parents. For example, many of the variants that cause significant genetic disorders turn out to be new genetic changes that neither parent carried. And the way to know that is to test both parents, and then you discover that the child has a new genetic change which explains their underlying medical condition. 49 out of the 142, so about a third, have had variants returned. 26 are so-called variants of unknown significance, but they're variants that have a plausible connection to the underlying phenotype, but we can't 100% prove that it's the cause. 12 likely pathogenic and 11 pathogenic. These are things that we think the evidence strongly favors that they are connected to the underlying phenotype. There have been 5 secondary variants. These are things actually from the same list that I showed you just a few moments ago that weren't the primary target. They don't explain the phenotype, but they're hard to ignore now that we've seen them because they could convey risk, for example, of cancer that would otherwise have gone unnoticed. Here's a list, which I realize you probably can't read, of some of the various genetic diagnoses that have been made in the affected cohort. And I think maybe as a kind of big picture summary, I'll say that almost all of these are exceedingly rare, fairly obscure conditions, and virtually never are the conditions that get identified from genomic sequencing on anybody's mind as a possible diagnosis when they're seen clinically. So in other words, we see a patient and send this test, and we get the result back, and it is almost always a surprise. These are conditions that are so rare in most cases that you just can't look at somebody and say, well, this looks like it's going to turn out to be whatever this is. So these are people who usually have already had multiple standard medical evaluations that were unrevealing until this. And virtually none of these is a treatable condition. That's why they're not on the list you saw earlier. So it's not like making this diagnosis now means, well, we can put you on the following treatment and expect a better outcome. What comes of these results is, for some people anyway, peace of mind of knowing exactly what the diagnosis is, knowledge of what to expect, because now there'll be some experience that you can fall back on and tell people what often happens in others with the same thing, knowledge of whether there might be a genetic basis and whether this could occur again to other members of the family. There is the hope over time, as we understand the underlying mechanism of their condition, that it can be translated into some kind of therapy, but I wouldn't argue that that necessarily is going to happen in a very short time frame. So I'm going to end with just a handful of points about bioethical issues from my perspective as a medical geneticist. I hope to set the stage for the conversation that will take place later today. I've divided it into issues of the population cohort and of the affected cohort. So first of all, false reassurance. One of our big concerns is that individuals get tested using this approach, and they get a result that says it was non-informative, which means no actionable variant was found, and they interpret that to indicate that they're not at risk of cancer or cardiovascular disease. And that is not true. Of course, not all forms of cancer and cardiovascular disease have a genetic basis to begin with. But even the genes that we're testing are not comprehensively analyzed in the course of this study. BRCA1 would be a prime example. We're not looking at every possible variant in the BRCA1 gene. This is a kind of big picture screen, and you think about half of the variants that might be picked up if you sequence that particular gene would be visible on our screen, but not all of them. Hence, a person who has a family history of cancer, let's say, or a personal history, and is interested in genetic testing really should have clinical testing, because the testing includes more genes than we're looking at and scrutinizes each gene with much greater precision. We saw somebody in clinic one time who had actually had a pathogenic variant in BRCA1, picked up clinically that was missed on AGHI, and she asked me, does that mean my results changed? And it turned out the variant that she has is just not represented on the chip that we're analyzing. So it's a known issue, and we try very hard to educate participants that we are not doing a comprehensive screen. We're picking up some of the kind of more common variants, but not all of them. So false reassurance, assuming now I've been tested negative and don't have to worry, is one concern that we've had. A second is non-penetrance. This is probably especially true in the cardiovascular arena, but it's also true in cancer. Having a pathogenic variant does not guarantee that you're going to develop the condition in question. It does indicate you're at higher risk based on studies done to date, but it does not mean that that is a 100% risk. And so it's important for participants who are the recipients of a positive result to know that this increases risk and there's a surveillance that may be appropriate, but it doesn't guarantee that you're going to develop the phenotype in question. Whether people appreciate that is one of the things that we're eager to learn more about. Unexpected medical findings could be a concern of individuals who had no idea that they were at risk and may or may not have thought it through when they undertook testing, and suddenly discover that there is a risk that wasn't on their radar screen before. You could take the point of view that that's a benefit to that individual, but it could also create concerns, stigmatization, anxiety, and the like. Sample discrepancies, we're very careful to keep the kind of samples, the sort of flow as sort of precise as is humanly possible. But we are really very cognizant of the fact that we have to be very cautious in terms of keeping the samples straight with regard to participants. And I think the lab has been extraordinarily responsible to avoid these kinds of problems, but it is a research study. And we do make an effort to verify results if ever there were any question. Withdrawal of consent has occurred. We've had a handful of people who have communicated with us to say they've changed their mind. And if that happens, we have a procedure where the samples are destroyed and any of the data, if they had opted into the database, is removed. So it's gone fairly smoothly, and we don't know exactly why people did change their mind. We don't really make any effort, because I guess we view that as sort of coercive, but it has happened a few times, and when it does, there's a pretty well-established approach to dealing with it. One of the biggest issues that we've been grappling with is the release of raw data. We're generating data on 700,000 single nucleotide variants on every person in the population cohort and the whole genome on those in the affected cohort. And you might imagine some people would be interested in getting access to those data so that they can have them analyzed, often by third parties. You can, for example, take the data we're generating, which, by the way, happens to be the same data that some of the commercial companies like Ancestry.com and 23andMe, they're using more or less the same approaches. They're not returning the same kind of data, but the material on the analysis is really the same. And you can download your raw data from those sites, and in principle, we could make raw data available from this too. And I'm sure you'll hear about the bioethical arguments on either side here in terms of whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'll just make a technical point about it, and that is that when data comes off the chip that we're looking at for the population cohort, if it's a common variant, it's usually pretty accurate just right off the chip. But if it's a rare variant, it turns out calling abnormal results from rare variants is not easy to do on the chip because they're rare and it's very difficult to validate them. So the way we deal with that practically is that anybody who gets a result that indicates a rare variant, that variant is replicated in a completely different separate test to make sure it's absolutely true. And so nobody gets a return of results where there's any doubt about that variant being present. But if you took your raw data and you sent it to a third party, and you can, that does an analysis, that wouldn't be happening. And it's guaranteed that there will be false positives, things that are not really there, but which the chip result indicated might be there, that the company is unlikely to know and will report back to you, you have risks that you actually don't have. So that quality control step of verification, which we do routinely, will not be happening with raw data. And people need to understand that's the risk that raw data analysis entails. From the affected cohort, for the most part, I think it's gone pretty smoothly in terms of individuals who really were searching for diagnoses, then being offered a diagnosis in some instances. It turns out, somewhat to my surprise, I guess, as a medical geneticist, when you finally get to the diagnosis, the reaction ranges from some degree of relief to know what is finally going on, to on the other end of the spectrum, we've had individuals who went through a tremendous effort to have sequencing done. And when the result finally came back, they would say, well, I don't really want to know it. And you say, well, so why did you participate if you weren't interested in the result? And I think a lot of people were doing, or not a lot, but at least some, on the hope that nothing would be found, hoping that maybe nothing is going on, even though clinically a lot was going on. And we've generally been able to work with those situations and ultimately kind of gain the trust of individuals to explain what was found and what was not found. But sometimes that comes up. And then secondary findings, what I already talked about, the fact that when you look for one thing, you might not find what you're looking for, but occasionally you find stuff you weren't looking for. And everybody is consented at the outset. Do they want to know secondary findings, which might be identified in the course of testing? Virtually everybody chooses to know them, but the option is there not to. All right, so I'll end at that. Just make the point that this is a complicated project with a lot of moving parts. There's an oversight committee. Besides myself, there are 2 other principal investigators. And we have multiple committees, a bioethics committee, the leadership of which, in part at least, is represented here today. There's a data and bioinformatics committee to oversee how the data are generated and stored. There's an education committee to provide educational materials and to help inform the writing of the reports. A genomics committee to keep an eye on the quality control of the genomic testing, and we do have the option of modifying the list of returnable results at any point. And then there's a participant and provider engagement committee in charge of our efforts to educate and engage the community and to learn from them as to where their concerns are and what's important to them. So it's a project that really has had a very large involvement from multiple people, both at UAB and at Hudson Alpha and in the wider community as well. I will stop there. I don't know what your plans are schedule-wise at this point.
I think we have time for a few questions.
There's some questions I can answer.
Please.
Happy to try.
Are there analogous projects in other states?
Yeah, the question is, are there analogous projects in other states? There's a few. I don't know of too many that are statewide in this sense, but there are institution-wide projects in a variety of places, and there are also national efforts. The UK Biobank and Genome England would be one example. There's a big population-based study in Estonia. And then, of course, in the US, David mentioned the All of Us project, and All of Us is something we're very much involved in, as you heard, and we'll also be doing whole genome sequencing on its participants, and there'll be a pathway there too for return of results. So I don't think this is unique, although I don't know of too many projects that are like ours, state-supported. Jennifer?
Dr. Korf, you mentioned in one of your slides that about 90% of the folks are consenting to participate in research. Sorry. And you mentioned also that withdrawal of consent may be one of the challenges. The question I have is anticipating the research opportunities, leveraging some of the data coming out of this project. And down the road, someone may choose that they don't want to be involved and they contact you to withdraw from the study. Those data will at that point have contributed to some of the results, some of the findings, and or they might be released to other collaborative researchers in the state or otherwise. Right. At what point can you not kind of reel it back?
You can reel it back if studies have already been done or samples have been shared. So the way the consent is written, in which the IRB has approved, is that if somebody tells you they wish to withdraw, at that point in time, the sample will be removed from the biobank and purged from the database, but that we can't undo samples that have been, we don't go out if the sample had been shared with somebody and say you have to send it back. It's being sent in a de-identified way, so it's not linked to that person. And secondly, if a study has already been done, it's been done, and you can't undo the study because somebody made that decision. So any such decision takes effect the day they've made that decision. From that point forward, nothing more would be done, but you can't take back what's already been done.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Sort of piggybacking off of Jennifer's question. So, you know, we talked about sharing the data back with participants, but how is the data going to be shared with the larger research community, such as, you know, some of these large dbGaP or GEO, you know, is there a mechanism embedded in the Alabama, you know, Genomic Health Initiative where that other folks, and then are there levels? So, you know, when you have the Cancer Genome Atlas, there's
We expect a lot of feedback from the audience.
Yeah, so it's, you know, so, you know, they have levels. Level 1, access, where you need IRB, where you don't need IRB, but if you go up to level 3, you do need IRB. How is that? Maybe that's the bioinformatics conversation we'll have later. How was that sort of the rollout to the research community, where we see that probably maybe the challenges will occur? How is that sort of going to be rolled out?
Yeah, so some things are actually embedded in the consent. For example, one of the things that does happen pretty regularly in the affected cohort is if a variant is found, it's shared on Matchmaker Exchange, which is a way of saying, well, we found the variant in a gene. Has anybody else anywhere else found a similar variant? And many of the diagnoses we make are because we found one that had never been reported before, but then somebody else also found it somewhere else in the world, and that puts together a experience that often turns a suspicion into a proven diagnosis. So that happens pretty regularly, and that's kind of embedded in the process. We haven't been putting all the data into Deep eGAP or any other kind of international database as of yet, at least. The data is in a kind of a regional database that we've kept. And I think really what we're likely to ultimately do is probably have been already putting data into ClinVar, which is when you find a variant that you believe is pathogenic or likely pathogenic, you register it with this national database. Those things are happening. And there is data sharing also built into the consent form, because that's really, in effect, the point of this is to be able to do data sharing and facilitate research. But I don't think it's been put into very large public databases.
We have one more question. We're running a little behind, so.
Okay, thank you. I'm Nancy Murner from Auburn University. So I relay research results back to my participants, and I've had to create a telegenetic counseling program to provide results back. I'm a researcher, so my panel of genes that I screen is research-based, it's not clinically accredited. So I'm curious if your screening is considered accredited, and how then do you build that bridge between research reports and genetic counseling? Because I provide my participants UAV genetic counseling through telemedicine, but at the caveat that this is a research report, so they would actually have to translate it, have clinical screening for the genetic counselor to actually truly counsel on that variant. Otherwise, it's like, oh, it's a hint towards we have something, but this is research, so we need to clinically validate. And then secondly, you have like approximately 50% of the people not wanting to share with their primary caregiver. What's interesting for me is most people are actually wanting results back. When we provide this telegenetic counseling option, which I thought was phenomenal because I'm reaching out to very underserved areas, people are not taking the opportunity. They don't want to translate it to the clinic. They want to have the information, and I thought I'd be helping them by trying to better help them manage the mutations because it's a cancer panel, but they're not taking the opportunity to do so. So I thought that was interesting. I don't know if they're scared. I don't know if they want it on their research, on their medical records, but it's kind of interesting. So I'd like to hear.
Yeah, it's a good set of points. I didn't make this clear, and I should have. When a actionable variant is found, the replication is in a clinical lab, and it is a CLIA grade report that comes back. So it actually could be used as a clinical decision-making point. And there isn't really an effort to do additional clinical testing because there is this CLIA verification. We are just now studying the outcomes in terms of what do people actually do with the information once it's been shared. Do they follow through with clinical testing, for example, risk of breast cancer? Do they communicate this information through their family? And so we only know anecdotally what we learned from talking with people either on the phone, because sometimes it is a phone counseling event, or face-to-face. But we're just beginning an effort to do longer-term follow-up to see what in fact happens.
Okay, thank you very much. So we'll move on. We're going to actually, Dr. Shodeke is here, but we're going to continue with our program as it was originally developed. So our next speaker will be Dr. Mariko Nakano, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Medical Education. She's a bioethicist, and she's both teaches ethics, medical ethics to medical students, but also is one of the leaders of the ethics committee on the AGHI, and she's going to. Okay. So I think, actually, Brian is running your slides for you, I think.
Okay.
Right?
Well, I can move this.
Yes.
Do this. Okay. So good morning. I'm Mariko Nakano from the Department of Medical Education and here at UAB. And I'm, and as Dr. Chaplin and Dr. Korf introduced, I'm co-chairing the Bioethics Working Group of the Alabama Genomic Health Initiative, together with Dr. Tom May from Hudson Alpha and Dr. Steven Shotake from Tuskegee University Bioethics, National Bioethics Institute. And as a bioethics working group members, we drafted the informed consent form of the AGHI, and we continuously review all the amendments made to the informed consent form. And also we provide bioethics training to patient navigators for the who recruit and inform the potential participants. And also we also provide bioethics training for all site coordinators who coordinate the recruiting events. And also we will discuss any ethics-related concerns raised through every step, of this AGHI activities. And today, in this section, we'd like to focus more on the bioethical issues around the return of results and discuss what sort of genotyping results the population genetic research participants should receive from the researchers. Okay. Oh, no, yeah, it will be done. And we want to explain how we, the AGHI, attempt to approach this issue. And this topic is particularly relevant to us because last year, one participant who underwent genotyping through the AGHI actually requested their raw data be returned and for their own personal exploration of health concerns. And so this request was passed on to the AGHI Bioethics Working Group, and we discussed this quite intensively with other AGHI leaders and others. So this is the outline of this section. And I'll explain the basic bioethics principles or core values of the AGHI. And also, we're going to discuss what we, the AGHI, currently return to population cohort participants. And in this section, I want to focus a little bit more on the population cohort and how to return results to them, rather than whole genome sequencing cohort. And we will discuss what we may be able to return to such participants, and look at the reasons why some participants may want to know more than what we currently return. And there are possible problems of granting full access to raw data, especially. And then we're going to finally discuss ethical issues of our research return of results by referring to our approach to this issue. So what we return, what we may be able to return, and what the reasons why some participants may want to know more, and possible problems of granting full access to raw data, and ethical issues of return of results. And I want to solicit discussions among us. So let me first explain the AGHI's core values, bioethics values. The AGHI Bioethics Working Group has set 4 core values that we should always keep in mind when conducting this sort of population genomic research. These are transparency / honesty and respect, confidentiality, and fairness. By transparency and honesty, we mean we should be honest about research benefits and risks, and we should not deceive or mislead potential participants. And by respect, we want to mean we should honor our patient's choice to participate or not to participate, and we should avoid exploitation or stigmatization, and we should respect privacy of the participants. And by confidentiality, we mean we should keep sensitive personal information confidential. And by fairness, we mean we should reach out to diverse population, and we should not exclude or exploit any specific group of people. And let's come back to these 4 core values later and discuss whether the AGHI's practice of returning results meet these 4 core values. But now let's look at what the AGHI is currently doing as regards to the return of results. So this is the first part of the AGHI's current negative result letter, what we return to genotyping cohort participants. It says, dear somebody, in the set of genes tested, we did not find any gene differences. It conveys the information that nothing was found. But it also emphasizes that, however, this does not mean that you will not develop any disease in the future. And it also does not rule out having a genetic risk factor for disease, even in the genes we tested. And in other parts of this letter, it also explained that the participants' risk to develop disease depends on many other factors as well. And also that our test is not able to find all genetic differences, variants, and that even with the negative results, the participants may still get at disease based on other factors, and that therefore participants should continue to receive follow-up and additional regular screening with their healthcare provider. And this is the positive result letter, an example. This is an example of the AGHI's current positive results letter. For example, this shows that this result shows that we have found a mutation in the BRCA1 gene, BRCA2 gene, and this it says that this result should be looked at in light of your personal and family medical history, and it also tells that this is a medically actionable result, and steps can be taken to lower this risk and detect cancer at an earlier, more treatable stage. And also, you and your doctor should discuss this finding and what it means for your cancer risk. So it will be followed by the genetic counseling and discuss medical care, and maybe it has a familial implications. So we need to discuss the implications to family members. So this is a positive letter. Now, as Dr. Korf explained in the that the AGHI will return medically actionable results. And these are the list of diseases or health conditions we actually return. This is pretty tiny letters, but we return 34 medical conditions on 59 genes, which are listed by the ACMG as medically actionable genes, medically actionable results. And so on the back of the result letter, there is a table showing 34 disease and the ACMG 59 genes we looked at. So these are all health conditions that are medically actionable, meaning that early medical intervention may prevent or delay the onset of the worrisome condition, or that such early medical intervention may help make the health condition better or more manageable. So these are all medically actionable results. But for the sake of comparison, this is what 23andMe currently returns to their customers. So 23andMe focused more on the recreational aspect, and they return 11 reports on 60 plus genes on health predisposition, like age-related macular degeneration, celiac disease, type 2 diabetes, based on their data from 23andMe research participants. And also there are some serious conditions, medical conditions like late onset Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, which are considered medically not really actionable results from our standard. And I think when the 23andMe customers before they receive these results, especially the Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, the customers are asked if they really, on the 23andMe pop-up screen, whether they really want to receive and see these results. And not only health predispositions, but also other information results will be given to customers as well. For example, they provide 44 reports on the carrier status, including some serious conditions like cystic fibrosis or Tay-Sachs disease. And this is the result we do not return to our participants in the AGHI. And also wellness, such as alcohol flush reaction or caffeine consumption, whether you have deep sleep or with genetic weight, and also the traits, like whether you have a widow's peak or whether you have a cheek dimples or something like that. And both the AGHI and 23andMe emphasize that these results are not comprehensive. These are only a limited set of information about select variants on select genes that are currently known to be associated with a limited number of health conditions or biological conditions. Anyway, of such long list of health conditions and traits returned to participants or customers, only 2 health conditions, which are familial hypercholesterolemia and hereditary breast and ovarian cancer, presented as BRCA1, BRCA2, and APOB genes and LR genes. These only 2 health conditions are common between 23andMe and the AGHI. So we return very different set of results to customers or participants. But we could return many more results than what we currently return. If there are no limitations on our budget or our human resources, and if we didn't care about the scientific accuracy of the results we return, and if we didn't care much about the ethical implications of return of results. Actually, the AGHI and 23andMe use pretty similar genotyping chips to do the screening. AGHI conducts a genotyping test of over nearly 700,000 DNA locations using a platform called the Illumina Infinium Global Screening Array. And 23andMe uses the same company's DNA array chip to test hundreds of thousands of DNA locations. And this is a comparison table of the screening array chip that each of these project uses. And both see over 600, nearly 700 markers to see the DNA locations. And you can add some markers to check up to similar number. So they use similar technology and material to check the DNA locations. So here are what the AGHI may possibly be able to return, but currently don't return, which are medically non-actionable results, and also carrier status, we do not return, and no medical biological traits, we do not return, but possibly we may possibly be able to provide ancestry-related information, and also we may consider returning full raw data found on the genotyping chip. But as for there are limitations we should consider. There are budget limitations and human resource. We have a limited number of genetic counselors to follow up. And also there's a questions about the scientific accuracy of the parts of the gene information which we cannot verify. As for the 59 gene results, we try to verify, and only the verified results we can be confident in. We can return we return to the participants. But as for other information which are on the raw data, which can be analyzed through using the raw data, we cannot guarantee that these are 100% accurate, so we do not return. And also, there can be ethical implications of returning results. And so as for medically non-actionable results, when we find some genetic variants that indicates increased health risks or for which we have no proven medical intervention to prevent or ameliorate the health condition, we don't return the results. And regarding ancestry or non-clinical medical traits data, we questioned whether or not we as researchers at an academic medical institution are obligated to return non-clinical data. So we wondered how we can responsibly return such non-clinical data. But we may be unjustifiably conservative as compared to other medical institutions in that we decided to return a limited number of medically actionable results, which is currently what's on the ACMG 59 list. There may be good reasons for a participant to know more about their medically relevant results, whether or not they are medically actionable. So we faced the question of whether or not we had better return these results to the AGHI participants, and to what extent we should do so, considering our limitations such as the budget and scientific accuracy and ethical implications. So now there may be good reasons for participants to receive some clinically relevant results, even if they are not medically actionable. So here, let's watch a video clip about a Michigan University's research study in 2011. In this study, researchers returned results to some willing participants about their genetic risks for Alzheimer's disease and examined how they reacted to such information.
I decided to participate in the study because I'm a nurse myself, and I really believe in research. And there's a family history of Alzheimer's. I wanted to know my Alzheimer's risk because my grandmother, 3 aunts, and an uncle all had Alzheimer's. And so I was anxious to know if indeed I was going to get it also.
The main idea for us in conducting our research is to try to figure out how people respond to genetic testing for Alzheimer's disease. So scientists have discovered a gene called apolipoprotein E, where if you have one particular variant of this, it elevates your chances of developing Alzheimer's in the future. But it's not, this variant is neither necessary nor sufficient to cause the disease.
Based on their age, their gender, their genotype, APOE genotype, and family history, they were provided with a lifetime risk for developing Alzheimer's disease, which was from birth to age 85. And then they were also provided with a remaining risk figure for developing Alzheimer's disease, which was their current age to age 85.
The results were that I was already 75 years old. I was a white woman. My sister and my mother did not have Alzheimer's, and I had none of the symptoms of Alzheimer's. So my risk factor was 16%. I had 2 of the genetic markers, E3 and E4.
Mine was that I had 1. When I found out what my results were, first of all, I was relieved because I only had 1 of the genes, not both. I did tell my husband, some of my other family members, and my very best friend. Just felt like, well, I know that. I wasn't surprised. And I didn't worry about it or think about it a lot.
What we found was that even the people who got so-called bad news seemed to adjust relatively well to the information. They did not have increased depression or anxiety following testing. And in fact, a lot of them found the information useful. They said it was helpful for them in thinking about future planning. Another interesting finding that we had was even though the information doesn't inform medical care, people were still using the information to take certain actions. So for example, we found that the people who found they were E4 positive, i.e. higher risk, were more likely to go out and purchase long-term care insurance after receiving this information.
I need a hug. This is what Annie does at the hospital. I'm more aware now the lifestyle behaviors. I was already working out, trying to watch my weight. I take a cholesterol lowering medication because high cholesterol also runs in my family, as well as heart disease. To say I'm perfect, no, but I've tried.
Another thing that we found was that people were more likely, if they were E4 positive, report some kind of addition of a vitamin or nutritional supplement, even though there are none that have been proven to lower risk of Alzheimer's. But there's actually been some talk in the media, maybe vitamin D is helpful, for example. So we found that a lot of people in our initial trials were reporting that they were adding vitamin D. It was interesting that people were trying to seek some kind of control and resorting to nutraceuticals that don't have any proven benefit at this point. Alzheimer's affects over 5 million people in the United States.
Okay, so there are a couple of points we can we can see in this video. So first of all, what this study shows seems to show is that with careful follow-up, if it comes with careful follow-up, some people, even when informed of increased genetic risk for a medically non-actionable condition, seem to adjust well to the information. They may not develop depression or anxiety after receiving the information. And also, such people may even perceive the information as useful, even when it doesn't inform clinical intervention. People may still use the information to take certain action, such as non-medical action, such as purchasing long-term care insurance or being more conscious of a healthy lifestyle. But at the same time, we should keep in mind that these may apply to some willing participants who are already interested in receiving this kind of results, and which this may not neatly apply to a broader population, which are like ours, the AGHI population cohort, who are a more broad range of people residing in Alabama. And also, this may be true with a careful follow-up by the genetic counselor, but which may be what we cannot really offer to all 10,000 participants who participate in the AGHI. So we need to keep those two things in mind. But there are good reasons for participants to know more than the medically actionable results on only 59 genes. And also, there are possible problems of granting full access to raw data, which is related to the scientific accuracy of the raw data. Okay, so this is a pretty recent news about the DNA test results wrongly tell Dallas man he has genetic condition. Brenda, could you please play that?
Friday, crispy bacon.
I'm sorry, we are not endorsing this product, but it has to play.
Get the Sonic French Burger or quarter-pound double cheeseburger and tots for $2.99. Going fast.
When radiologist president Dr. Joshua Tate had a special go back in a popular DNA testing kit, he said he did it please myself. And so he got a kit for his staff. For $5 extra, a third-party lab was running his bond data through a database with research to see if he had a gene variant linked to disease. And the result came back positive. It told him he had a mutation linked to what's called Lynch syndrome, a genetic disorder that leads to potentially deadly cancer at an early age.
Look here, I might have something that I have to act on for that slide. The couple of questions. What now that I know about. I really like. And at the time of this series.
So in search of a Lynch syndrome expert, you went to Theo Ross, director of the Cancer Genetics Program in West. Normally, when we get one of these tests, we just take them and put them in the shredder and do a real test. That's it, do a clinical test that we do. And the clinical test found Joshua did not have the potentially cancer-causing gene mutation. What did he?
Okay, good. You know, obviously, means I don't have to go through all those screenings. Our family didn't have to.
I think awareness of genetics is great. That those companies, all of them have done a very good job of advertising that genetics is important. It's not a health test. It is not going to tell you about your predisposition. Dr. Mossmore and consumers don't realize their results from popular DNA kits are not conclusive. He said you should take them with more than a grain of salt. And that holds true even more so for people who come back with a perfect. 98% of people who don't have cancer but have one of these mutations that should be followed don't know that. Joshua considers himself one.
About 5 minutes, nothing to send the results. What about people who live 3 hours in the medical center, don't know the contact?
You'll carry him somehow.
So probably this happened because of the false positive data on the part of the data, unverified data on the raw data that he downloaded. Now, if you want to download the raw data from 23andMe and other third-party custom company, there is a screen explaining that this may not be 100% accurate. And this guy actually didn't know that there can be false positive, but it caused sufficient amount of confusion and anxiety in him. So we need to be mindful of that. So the question is, so then what should we do? For example, the AGHI researchers. Should researchers return the following medically non-actionable results, knowing that it may cause some relief in some participants, or but some other participants may feel very embarrassment or confusion, and whether we should return carrier status also, and non-medical biological traits, ancestry-related information, or should we provide full raw data, access to full raw data found on the genotyping chip that we use. And we should consider the limitations that we have, the budget, scientific accuracy, and clinical certainty, and ethical implications of returning such results. And we want to listen to the current AGHI participants talk after following this session, and we want to discuss this together. And now this is what we are currently attempting to do. This is the AGHI's approach to this issue. So we decided that in the genotyping informed consent form, we said we should clearly state that in consideration of the limitations we currently have, we should clearly state that we plan to return a limited number of medically actionable results to all participants, which is currently 59 gene list found to be medically actionable by the ACMG. But when an AGHI participant requests access to raw data, we think we shouldn't limit access to them because we want to maintain public trust in our project, and we want to be transparent and honest. But the people who request the access to raw data should be informed of the limitations to our technology. So we decided to provide. We are attempting to provide a separate informed consent process to such request, and to let him or her consider scientific limitations and ethical implications of receiving and using raw data. So this is the what we are trying to accomplish in the next several months. So getting back to the 4 core values again, we want to be transparent. And the transparent, also, we believe that transparency also implies that we should be honest about limitations to the technology we utilize. And we also think that by respect, we should also mean we should avoid causing unnecessary anxiety or confusions. And by being more transparent, we try to regain trust from participants. Okay, so this is where we are as of the AGHI Bioethics attempt to approach to these issues. Okay.
Great, thank you. So we're pretty far behind. We'll have time to have a sort of general discussion, but if there's specific questions for Dr. Nakano that relate to what you said right now, put your hand up and we'll try to take them, but otherwise, I think we'll move ahead. Thank you very much, that was great. Okay. So, Dr. Shodake? Okay, the next portion is going to be led by Dr. Stephen Shodake, who is a professor and bioethicist at Tuskegee University and the National Center for Bioethics. And he's going to lead us into a discussion of trust and trustworthiness.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Before I forget, I've been asked to announce that lunch will be served at 12:15. 12:15. Is that it, Ms. Lee? 12:15, right? Okay. I needed for you to know that. I want to apologize for my not being here early this morning. Murphy's Law did creep in. I'm assuming you know what Murphy's Law is, right? Yes, Murphy's Law, if anything can go wrong, it will go wrong. But it didn't prevail. Murphy's Law did not prevail. God's law prevailed. In terms of the ordering of how the presentation should actually be made. I'm going to repeat it again, but I'll say it right now. Good ethics starts with good facts. And I'm not talking about alternative facts. I'm talking about real facts. So the presentation from Dr. Kov, my colleague, and Dr. Nakano were great facts about what we are currently facing. So my role then is just to let you know how we got here. That we didn't get here willy-nilly. We got here by methodically planning for it. But time flies, and it's hard to believe that it's been 1 year since we gathered the critical mass here for the first in the Bioethics Forum series on trust and trustworthiness. Today we're here by God's grace to work together again. So I want to welcome those of you that are not so new, are part of the first discussion forum, and all of those that are newly joining us, as well as those that are joining us by satellite. We truly believe that all of you are potential change agents whose views and perspectives do matter to us because they will enrich the conversation and move us one step further in our mission. So I want to acknowledge and give recognition to all of these people, some of which you have met. Have you met Dr. Remy? Dr. Remy was to the rescue this morning. Thank you. And you have also heard from the rest of them. Dr. Yates, are you here? There's Dr. Yates there, my colleague at Tuskegee University, and Ms. Lee, who does logistics, who I have the utmost respect for because I do not do logistics. So I have a lot of respect for people who do. All right, so let's talk about how we got here. We got here trying to discuss why we should conduct these Bioethics Forum series. We talked about the need for all segments of our society to be included in research. And we just had to face the fact that there is no research that does not have risks. And the fact that those who are volunteering in research, for research, actually are vulnerable in one way or the other. When clinicians become researchers, there is a tug of war, if you will. And there's this development of the mindset of having to really keep a focus on research versus medical care, or medical care versus research. As you can see, when Dr. Koff presented and Dr. Nakano as well, we're trying to make certain that folks understand that AGHI is a research project. Could be useful, but naturally, as Dr. Nakano has also shown, participants usually have some legitimate expectations, and that needs to be kept in mind, lest there is confusion of what is really medical care with what is research. That's called therapeutic misconception from this part of the side of the participants. Destroys or mistrust increases the tension between this relationship. If distrust were to be there, mistrust were to be there, it just creates quite a bit of tension. And public trust is also eroded if we don't mind, if we don't pay attention to rebuilding this trust. That's already in trouble because of some egregious acts of the past. So the trusting and trustworthiness of researchers and research institutions, if we don't pay attention to these as well, can actually become elusive. And that is precisely the reason why we are trying to do what we are trying to do within the CCTS partnership. So there is a need then to rebuild public trust, protect the rights and well-being of research participants, and you've heard what we've been trying to do with the AGHI. Routinely, there are updated national and international regulations that we must pay attention to as well. Oversights are needed by research, of research activities by IRBs. I think you picked up from Dr. Kov's presentation about how the Institutional Review Board is critically involved in this. The final common rule is in effect now. And so issues of trust and trustworthiness remain very, very central to our activities here. And so that's why we figured that trust and trustworthiness must be understood. And in order to do that, we wanted to create a reflective space such as you are experiencing now, so that we can have this conversation and promote trust and trustworthiness justly. This is one of the three set of references that I consulted as we prepared for the forum. This is the second of the three, and this is the third of the three. The references continue to grow by the month and by the weeks, even, if you will. So we started out talking then about barriers to participation in genetic and genomic research. That's how we started. That was the context in which we started this conversation. Today, what is the context today? What is the context today? Return of results. I dare say return of value, actually, because somebody raised the question as to whether this returning result does not go beyond the individual. Does it affect the communities, the scientific communities as well, and as to what we do or don't do about any of these. So we had some premises. We tried to understand what trust and trustworthiness is, and we raised some questions and we had some reflections. We noted that the foundational pillars in any relationship will be trust and trustworthiness. And so this is not just in research, but in any relationship, generally speaking. And we examine how thinkers have understood these pillars and how we understand them, because we believe that it can inform our actions in a good way or in less desirable ways. We illustrated how mistrust or untrustworthiness can play out in real life in the research contexts. We examine what kind of values may drive trust and trustworthiness and what kind may derail them. We raised the question as to how our knowledge of the identified individual and institutional characteristic drivers assist us in engaging research participants ethically with desired results. And how would we know whether or not what we are doing is making a difference at all? This is the reason why we formulated at least two purposes. One, to create the reflective space, because we can't just do it anywhere, that will engage stakeholders and in the research enterprise and the need for critical reflection. We also wanted to collaboratively facilitate the conversation to increase awareness of and reflections on the tensions and the concerns and other pertinent issues that are crucial to promoting and maintaining a culture of trust and trustworthiness in collaborating CCTS institutions and network that are engaged in biomedical research nationwide. We did that by focusing on 6 objectives, one of which is to facilitate the exploration of these concepts of trust and trustworthiness while discussing and affirming what you stakeholders' understandings are. And then the second thing that we did was to understand the needs for the reflection on issues of trust and trustworthiness in biomedical research. We were able to, I would say, complete those 2. That's why I highlighted them in red. But today, we will get to a point where we will seek our participation in trying to imagine what a culture of trust and trustworthiness in collaborating institution would look like. Because if we can imagine it, then chances are we'll be able to put things in place that will help us to accomplish it. But if we cannot imagine it, then we're in big trouble. So here is let's see, did I go too fast?
Yeah.
Okay. I have a bit of a problem with this thing. The 4th was to formulate practical steps for promoting trust and trustworthiness among collaborating institutions and those volunteering for research. My sense is that we'll be able to concentrate on objectives 3 and 4 today, all the way towards the end. So I encourage you to listen very carefully and pay attention, because we are going to seek your thoughts and in a rather creative way. The 5th objectives that we set out to help us accomplish our goal was to figure out or discern benchmarks for assessing the adequacy of trustworthiness, and then to propose effective actions for improving the engagement, recruitment, and retention of research participants in collaborating CCTS institutions and nationally. So we looked at the epistemology then of trust and trustworthiness. That means, what do we know and how do we know it? The concepts of trust, we examined that as well as the concepts of trustworthiness. And then we sought your understanding. We looked at the literature, find out and brought to you what's in there, and then we sought your understanding by having you use what your thoughts are, completing a words collage. So here are the references that we used in trying to help us understand what's out there in terms of the idea of trust. Okay, there's quite a few references out there, but I just picked out the ones that are salient. And then there are also quite a bit of references out there as far as trustworthiness is concerned. You may recall that while we were discussing this, I indicated to you that there is certainly more, But even the ones that we have looked at, I raised the question as to whether these propositions actually square with researcher and the research personnel experiences. Having listened to Dr. Kov and Dr. Nakano, that's the kind of question that is applicable even to today. So we said for the audience at that time to help us demonstrate your understanding of trust and trustworthiness. We built a collage, if you remember. We tried to do that towards the end of this session as well. And here's what we came up with, right? The boldest one there, and you can see transparency. This is it's a touch board. Transparency, honesty, integrity, caring, and there are so many others, vulnerability. The things that tend to hover around the 4 core principles, ethical principles that guided and is still guiding the Alabama Genomic Health Initiative, right? So it sounded like at the end of the day we were in good shape, right? Because you saw it. And you can hear it again as Dr. Kov and Dr. Nakano presented. The second session was devoted to examining mistrust and untrustworthiness as barriers to research participation. You may recall that we talked about the USPHS study of syphilis at Tuskegee, untreated syphilis at Tuskegee. How many of you are familiar with that? Okay, the full house. So that's great. We looked at that time. We asked you what was particularly troubling to you. And then we used a second case, which was the Havasupai case versus the Arizona State University Board of Regents. And we actually played that at that particular time, if you recall. I left the URL there so that in case, how many people are familiar with that? Okay, quite a few still. All right, so we did that at that particular time. Well, and we asked the question, what's particularly disturbing to you? We had a brief discussion about that. Today we can add this case, paradigmatic case, the case of Henrietta Lacks and the Johns Hopkins Hospital. How many of us are familiar with that? Okay, the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks. We actually have an exhibit at Tuskegee University. If you visit, if and when you visit us next time, do take time to go to the Legacy Museum and observe the whole shebang there. Huh? All right, so you know a little bit about, you know the case as well, the famous book that came out. And this is where I pause to ask you the same question. What is particularly disturbing to you about this case? You're supposed to talk to me. What's disturbing to you about this case? We'll listen to 1 or 2 people. Hello? Anybody out there? Yes?
Well, as you have the idea of getting informed consent was not something that was part of clinical research, and so she had no chance to say yes or no.
Okay. Yeah. So facts are important. Good ethics, you know, relies on good facts. Okay. And we need to tell what we do know. And then when we don't know, we say we don't know, right? Okay. Any others? One more. Yes, way back there. Okay. She didn't have any idea of the seriousness of the case, neither did the family even know that these cells are all over the place until so many years later. Okay, so why do we need trust and trustworthiness in biomedical research? We also looked at that. What do we know? How do we know it? What ought we to do about it? We indicated that trust is important because it allows us to form relationships with people and to depend on that relationship. But we noted that even when trust is warranted, it is risky business and sometimes dangerous, right? And so we say lack of trust, though, can jeopardize the research enterprise. Now, all of these are in the literature, and I put the appropriate literature that speaks to these observations there. A lack of trust is also a barrier for consenting to research. That was observed by Dr. Kobe Smith and Dr. Jeremy Sugarman way back when. Researchers, though, should concentrate on building trust relationship with participants and communities. Dr. Patricia Marshall and Dr. Rotimi and Ruth Fading all observed that do researcher experiences support these assertions? You bet you, because you heard from Dr. Kov and Dr. Nakano as well. To say that some people are still not well represented as well as we would like for them to be represented in clinical research is a statement of fact, but for various reasons. But then there are other reasons why some people say, no, 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 no. If people really distrust biomedical research, then there should be a decrease in biomedical research involving humans then. Should we observe that? Not an increase, because for some folks, there is increase, and then for some, there is still sort of not as much as we would like for it to be. So we ended up asking the question, is trust as important as we are led to believe? Or can there be ambivalent trust? We asked what your thoughts are at that particular time, because people may not want to trust all the way. People may want to say, yeah, I trust, but up to a point. Yeah, so. And of course, we entertain the panel discussion here so that the AGHI, those involved in recruitment and retention, could share with us. Dr. Julie Sachs was here, Dr. Nakano was also here. We talked about the future Bioethics Forum, and this is where I bring back our purpose, two purposes, just to alert us to the fact that here is what we're still sort of operating on. I put what we have already done in red so that we will know that we can count those as having been addressed. Then I put in blue, highlighted in blue, the ones that we are trying to focus our attention on today. In other words, imagine a culture of trust and trustworthiness in all of our institutions and in the research, within the research community. What are some practical steps? What would that look like? And what are some practical steps in which we will promote this trust and trustworthiness among institutions as well as the those who volunteer for research? All right, so we've already heard from Dr. Nakano, Dr. Kov. I think 3, 4, 5, and 6 will come later on. So that is how we got to where we are today. At the end of, towards the end of the session, we'll give you an opportunity to just imagine a world that's different from this so far as the culture of trust and trustworthiness in all of our various institutions are concerned. Remember, I said everyone in this room and those joining us by satellite will look at you as moral agents because you can bring significant amount of importance to the conversation because of your varied perspectives. So that's where we will be when I come back. I believe the ones next now are the lessons from the Jackson study. Did we get questions, comments?
So, as I think you're all aware, we're a little behind schedule. Here's our adjustment to the schedule. So we have a couple of minutes if you want to bring up specific issues now related to Dr. Shodake's presentation. But we'll have until 11 o'clock for people to get coffee and have a bathroom break if needed. And then we will hear from Dr. Adolfo Correa from Mississippi, who is joining us virtually, and he has a pretty finite schedule, so we will start at 11 exactly. And then we will, as soon as his presentation is finished, we'll have our panel discussion, and then lunch with time to discuss the details of what Dr. Shodake has introduced here.
All right, so my name is Adolfo Correa. I'm an epidemiologist. I train in pediatrics in the University of California, San Francisco, and in Ohio, then moved on to Johns Hopkins to pursue further training in public health and epidemiology, where I was on the faculty for a number of years before going back to CDC to work as a medical officer on congenital heart defects. And then I came to the Jackson Heart Study in 2011 to serve as Chief Science Officer and became the principal director and the director and principal investigator in 2015. The Jackson Heart Study, as Dr. Chaplin was saying a few minutes ago, it's the largest single-site community-based study of cardiovascular disease among African Americans. It enrolled 5,300 African American adult residents of the metro area of Jackson in the years of 2000 to 2004. The data collection on study participants has been ongoing since 2000, and it has included 3 consecutive extensive or comprehensive examinations, annual follow-up for morbidity and mortality of the participants, surveillance of, again, hospitalizations for coronary heart disease, stroke, heart failure, and again, overall mortality. The recruitment of participants for genetic studies occurred during exams 1 and exam 2, but the return of results of genetic studies was never addressed in the consent process. Now, in the last few years, the DNA of participants, of consenting participants for genetic studies has undergone whole genome sequencing. So now we have whole genome sequencing on about 3,400 participants. And the questions that have come up are, when can we return results? What kind of results should we return? And in thinking about what we might return, we became aware of a number of issues or questions about this process, including, what should the process and infrastructure for returning results consist of? What should the consent look like? which results should be returned, who should return the results, and when and how to engage healthcare providers effectively. In addition, we had questions about the cost involved. Who should pay for the cost of returning results? Should the study pay for it? Most cohort studies don't have resources to do that, including the Jackson Heart study. Should health insurance cover that? And we don't necessarily think that health insurance companies would be willing to cover for that. And it would be unfair to expect participants or family members to pay for the return of results. The other issue that came up as we were thinking about this is, what do we know about the impact of return of results on participants, the health benefits and the risks, psychosocial, cost of follow-up, and impact on family members. So in order for us to come up with some kind of a protocol for returning results, we thought we would have a workshop and to elicit experience and recommendations about this process. So we had this workshop a couple of years ago in Jackson, where we engaged participants as well as other members of the community in Jackson, geneticists, genetic counselors from around the country, ethicists, legal scholars who have been thinking about the return of results, particularly genetics studies. We included representatives of faith-based organizations, investigators from other studies with experience in return of genetic results, as well as some of the investigators from the Jackson Heart study. And out of this workshop, we elicited a number of recommendations about the process, about the infrastructure, and I'll go over some of those highlights. So to begin with, everybody thought that the consent process needs to prepare participants better than it has done in the past. And the consent should include a number of considerations or preferences for the participants, such as, what type of results should be returned, all or none, or should it be a menu-driven approach? And I'll go and say a few more words about that in a minute. But there was a recommendation to have a disclosure statement that the types of results offered for return will evolve over time based on new knowledge, technologies, and expert consensus. And it was thought that it would be important to have some questions for participants in the consenting process, such as, whether and how results will be communicated to their healthcare providers, and how results should be handled if they die. In terms of eliciting consent preferences or options, in past exams in most cohort studies, the analysis of DNA or genetic specimens have been done before eliciting the consent preferences from participants. And it was thought that in the future, we should be eliciting the preferences for the participants before we do any genetic analysis. So in future examinations, such as in the Jackson Heart study, we're going to have another examination next year. The recommendation is for us to reconsent participants for the return of genomic results, and that we probably should work out logistics for having a CLIA, a sample for CLIA analysis. And so we should obtain a new sample and hold it in a CLIA lab for future confirmation of any research findings. Currently, there is no protocol for addressing the impact of genetic results on families or deceased participants. So in the new protocol, there's a recommendation that we should consider how to handle the return results if a death occurs. We need to think about, who should receive the results, which family members would be considered next of kin, and who would determine that. Would the proband need to decide and consent as to who gets the results? And then this information goes to the family, who determines that? Another set of recommendations about process related to, again, the type of results to return. In the past, the general approach was to not return any results, and that's considered no longer an option going forward. The other possibility is to return all results, but in this workshop, there was a consensus that that's not necessarily practical, useful, or respectful, and that perhaps something in between should be considered, and namely that's interpreted results as what should be returned. And now the question is, what do interpreted results include? Well, they could include the Mendeliome, which includes about 4,000 genes, but that's a very large size of genes, and it requires an extensive amount of resources, effort, and cost. Another consideration is to use the Geisinger 76 or the ACMG 59 that was mentioned in the previous presentation as a minimum, plus the study-specific findings, recognizing that the ACMG 59 is designed for secondary findings, not as a primary screening list or tool, and that it's not a mandate. It's more of a fallback position. Perhaps in the initial process of doing this return results, maybe it makes sense to think about a smaller customized list that can be carried out with the resources available. And maybe that list could be something that could be arrived by consensus with participants, taking into consideration their priorities. In terms of infrastructure, I think that most people felt that the return results should include genetic counselors or some kind of telemedicine support, and that there should be an effort to move the information, the follow-up, screening, and carrying to the clinical realm as soon as possible. But the question comes up, how do you engage the clinical practitioners in this process? How do you inform them about the results and what they may need to do? There was also thought that studies should have a clear policy about, in the consent, indicating that genetic counselors would be available for participants, and that also the study, in most cohort studies, the study cannot pay for additional medical follow-up or testing. So there will need to be some clear guideline as to who's going to be responsible for that. And then the question that comes up all the time is, what about family members, the cascade testing that may be appropriate to conduct? How should that be handled in terms of the genetic counseling resources, medical follow-up resources, and cost? And that there was no clear recommendation about what we specifically need to do about that. Now, again, in terms of infrastructure, the current practice is that every study is doing variant identification, clear confirmation, and interpretation. So there's a reinventing the wheel model right now, which is not very efficient. And that's depicted on this slide where we have this, for illustration, various cohort studies that have been doing whole genome sequencing for consented participants, identifying the variants, planning to do interpretation, and engage genetic counselors to return results to participants in their respective studies. And an ideal model that has been proposed is to have a centralized resource for CLIA sequencing, interpretation, and telegenetics. And perhaps NHLBI could play a major role in that process. The advantage of this centralized resources that it builds on or takes advantage of economies of scale and make sure that there are standardized procedures for all these steps. So this next slide just provides an illustration of what the centralized research resource could look like. But at this point, it's not clear who would be willing to take the role or responsibility for a centralized resource. So maybe a compromise in the meantime is to have the Transomic for Precision Medicine initiative that's supported by NHLBI develop a pilot for a centralized interpretation service for ACMG 59. In terms of cost, the recommendation is that each study should carry the cost of the clear confirmation and genetic counseling. And then in terms of health insurance, if a participant has no insurance, who decides whether he or she should be screened for pathologic variants and the follow-up, medical follow-up that may be needed for that. And then the cost of family members, or the cascade testing for family members, again, it's not clear who would be responsible for that, but it needs to be addressed. So a proposed approach that came out of that workshop for the Jackson Heart study is where the analysis of DNA specimens, the whole genome sequencing analysis has already been done before consent for return results was carried out, is that we plan to collaborate on an ancillary study with Framingham, the Framingham Heart Study, that's led by Robert Green of the Broad Institute, and Basan Ramachandran of Framingham and myself over the next few years. And the plan is to consent study participants for the return of results of pathologic variants listed in the ACMG 59. And that it's anticipated that it would involve maybe about 70 participants out of the 3,400, and that we would offer clear confirmation, genetic counseling, pay for the clear confirmation and genetic counseling, and make arrangements for referral for medical follow-up as soon as possible, and perhaps also pay for medical follow-up for those without health insurance. And then the plan is to evaluate the impact of the return results on health, psychological, and economic outcomes. And the last slide here, just a list of individuals who participated and contributed to the discussions in the workshop. So we have a link available that shows the materials that we used for the workshop, as well as the recommendations. So with that, I'll stop and take questions.
Thank you very much. It's much appreciated. It's clearly a very thoughtful workshop. People have specific questions I'd like to ask Dr. Correa? Have you had feedback from the study participants about what issues really are their personal drivers? Were they the ones who helped you think about the cascade testing kind of issues, or how did that come about?
So those topics came up during the discussions that we had with all the participants in the workshop, including participants of the study and other members of the community, and clinical geneticists and genetic counselors. So for genetic counselors and clinical geneticists, that's common activity when they cascade testing. So, but I think that's a topic that we need to have more discussions on. That was one of the, again, recommendations from the workshop, that we need to have more conversations with participants in the community on this issue of return results. Because we just identify a number of issues in this workshop that require a little more deliberation for the implementation of the process. I think one of the values of the workshop was that it helped us come up with a protocol that was submitted, a research protocol that was submitted to NHLBI for funding. I think so far it's the only research protocol that is focusing on the return results that is funded. So we hope that from this exercise, we'll be able to inform about the practice of doing this in cohort studies that will help other cohort studies then come up with the resources that they need to do this. I think because one of the challenges that most cohort studies have had is the lack of resources. The few, I think there are a couple of cohort studies that are starting to do this return results, but they're paying for that process out of their own funds. It's not being supported by any budgets in particular for that.
I was wondering whether you could elaborate on the idea that returning all of the results from a study is felt to not be respectful of the participant.
Yes, so that we had a lot of discussion about that, and it was thought that we have whole genome sequencing on the 3,400 participants. That's a lot of data, and a lot of it is not easily. So you would need a lot of resources to interpret what's all in there, and if we're not able to do that, what can the participants do with that information? How can they use that in a meaningful way? And I don't know if maybe there's something that we need another approach that we need to think about, but the concern was that there would be a lot of potential for misinformation or misunderstanding, and it just we could. The option of giving everything to participants is there, but the recommendation is that as a responsible, if they wanted, I suppose that's something that could be explored. But in terms of the role of the study, in terms of returning results, it was thought that it's important to provide context for those results.
I'm curious whether you've had any conversations with the funding agencies to know whether there's an appetite to pay for the kind of additional feedback to participants that you're advocating, which seems like something that would need to be, in a policy way, built into all of these kind of studies.
We have, we haven't had focused discussions on their willingness to, or their ability to pay for more extensive conversations with the participants on this topic. There are other groups who are interested in doing projects that engage, that have more conversations with community and participants to approach the return results more from a participant perspective than from a research perspective, where I think some of this, and I think that's needed, and so we're hoping that we'll see those come to fruition.
Okay, just for people's interest, there was an RFA released by the NIH recently for administrative supplements through the, I think this is actually, I'm not sure if this is specifically through the NCATS, I think so, regarding research on bioethical issues that could be used to address some of these issues. So if there are people in the audience with a special interest in this, I know there's a consideration among people here at UAB whether well, I think there's a general feeling that we should respond to this RFA. It's a question of exactly what focus to take. And Dr. Correa's presentation have brought up a lot of issues that are ones that perhaps could be part of that kind of an application to study this in more detail. So if you have thoughts and have the appetite to participate, I encourage you to send me or Dr. Korf feedback about this, and we'll try to make sure everybody who's interested gets a chance to participate. We've had a little bit of feedback from people online about some questions. Firstly, I just want to make it clear that we will be sending out a PDF of all of the slides to both the people who are here, who like to have a digital copy they can keep track of, maybe better than paper, and we'll send to everybody who registered to be online, who's actually given us their email address as part of the login process. If you didn't do that as you logged in, please email me your interests and I'll make sure you get a copy of the slides. One of the questions was, how harmful or beneficial do you think companies offering genetic testing in addition to ancestral DNA testing like 23andMe are, and how do you think they may impact genetic testing and research in these areas, especially as it relates to the trust and trustworthiness and use of the collected data? Would anyone like to take that on? So the question was, what do we think of companies that offer genetic testing like 23andMe, whether they're harmful or beneficial to the population, and how do you think they may be impacting people's willingness to participate in genetic research, given that this kind of information can be gained in some form in other ways?
You know, the issue of direct-to-consumer testing, which is what 23andMe and Ancestry.com and groups like that are engaging in, it's a controversial one because there is no health professional anywhere in the loop unless you decide to engage one on your own. And there is therefore concern about how individuals will understand information that is provided, and then the point that was made in the video about false positive results remains a concern as well. The other side of the coin is that I think these companies take the perspective that you own your own data and have the right to do with it as you wish, and they are providing information without really telling you exactly how you're intended to use it. It's a fairly small subset of people that have the resources and the interest in embarking on this. I think that story about the false positive is a point I made also, that the nature of the data that comes off the chip is inevitably going to have false positives, and I do think that has to be made really clear as individuals go forward. If you read the not so fine print, it'll be pretty clear that that's something that you need to be careful about. And I don't know if the third parties that, for example, did the analysis there have made that point or not. So, you know, it remains a controversial issue, and there's cogent arguments, I think, on both sides of that as to the degree to which companies should embark on this sort of direct-to-consumer testing. I will say there's a pretty robust consent process attached to it, so it's not for lack of effort on their part to inform people of what the potential risks are.
So I just want to give a little explanation to what we're about to do. So very grateful that one of the organizers of the patient interaction part of subject interaction part of the AGHI helped us identify 4 participants who were willing to give us a little bit about their own personal experience with participation in the study, and also to take your questions. And we also have Whitley Kelly here, who is one of the genetic counselors, who has not interacted with any of these participants directly herself, but has been taking a substantial role in the AGHI to help to moderate the discussion. We're recording these sessions to allow people who haven't been able to be here present to participate directly to hear the discussion later. And in an effort to protect the privacy of the participants, we're going to refer to them as participants 1, 2, 3, and 4, rather than give their specific names. And so that's why we're taking this sort of covert attempt to keep people's privacy protected. They very graciously have indicated that they're fine with us doing this recording, but we want to protect their privacy. So, and so we'll go ahead and get started. So we'll introduce Whitley Kelly, who has no need to be protected. And thank you very much for helping.
Sure. Again, my name is Whitley Kelly. I'm one of the genetic counselors for the Alabama Genomic Health Initiative. Very glad to be here with you today. I'm learning a lot from all the presentations. I'm really looking forward to talking with these participants today. I have a few questions that I've prepared to ask them, but at any point, I want this to be a discussion as much as possible. So at any point, if you have something burning that you would like to ask, feel free to do that. I will ask our participants to just briefly give a couple of sentences really about, we don't need to know your name or any personal details. What we're really interested in knowing to distinguish all of this afternoon is something about where you are in the study. So I understand at least one participant has not received results yet. So you may want to comment on how long ago you enrolled or that sort of process. Or if you have received a result, what that result is, so we can kind of get an idea of the landscape here. And if you want to, as part of your introduction, you may want to go ahead and share with us how you learned about the AGHI and or what motivated you to participate. That may have all kind of come at the same time. So if participant 1 would like to begin.
Yes, I heard about the study online and found out that I was adopted about 8 years ago, and felt like that this would give me some good information that otherwise I would not have been able to have had. I have heard my results and was tested positive for the gene abnormality, which can is associated with cardiomyopathy. Did I say that right? And that's where I am.
I learned about this project through a colleague. I have yet to receive my results. I enrolled about a month ago, so not too long of a time considering the processes I'm sure that are involved in just going through. But,
So I have been enrolled in the study, I believe, a year now, so I have received my results. I have a marker for what I believe is called long QT syndrome. I'm not a clinician, so I know what that is now, but at the time I did not. I essentially was encouraged to attend by a family member, or that is my spouse, who strongly encouraged me to attend, but I also have a number of other colleagues who were aware of the study and encouraged us to all kind of participate in this together. Just simply to find out more about kind of my background.
I see your wife knows my wife. I was strong armed by my wife to come. I did not want to go, but I did receive my results. I've been in this for about a year now, and there was nothing found on my test. But yeah, it was my wife that got me there.
So my next question, and again, this would apply to all 4 of you because you all 4 have been consented into this study. You've noticed this morning that we spend a lot of time talking about what we think concerns are based on previous experiences, previous studies, kind of the backgrounds that all of us kind of come at this from. But I'm curious to learn from you guys, as you were reviewing that consent form, as the patient navigator or whomever consented you was going over that information with you, what were some things that stood out, if anything, that were things that kind of maybe gave you pause, made you think twice, the things that in your mind were potential areas of concern for this study? Maybe it was a privacy issue, maybe it was worry about what results you might have received, or maybe nothing, and that's fine to share too.
At the time I did the study, which was about 6 months ago, I really didn't have any concerns. All I was focused on was learning something about my, background from a medical aspect.
likewise, I felt no significant concerns about any privacy issues of use of my data. It was mostly my curiosity of my own health, and I've been I've worked with in the medical field before, so I understand HIPAA regulations and all that. So there was nothing too surprising in the consent form for me.
Yeah, I likewise during the consent process was not concerned about what they might find. My understanding was that the emphasis would be on modifiable factors. So it was, the results themselves were not a concern. It was, interestingly enough, it was after going through the process and talking with these colleagues that some of them started saying, well, you know, I did not consent to release these results to my provider because I'm concerned that the confidentiality of this might affect my health insurance status or my premiums. And only then did I start to step back and say, oh, well, interesting. I kind of went down that path. So it was after the consent process that I had some additional concerns.
It was similar for me. I had no worries in the beginning. I did, when I went through it, I realized that I didn't know what this was. And as people started to talk to me, I was like, wow, why didn't, if it wasn't for my wife, why come I didn't know? Because now I've started telling my brothers, started telling my father about this. So for me, it was more so of, number one, getting the consent. But then as I started to listen to what it was all about, I'm like, whoa, okay, so this can actually save some lives. So it was more knowledge for me than it was anything. I wasn't really worried about the results at the time.
So participant 3, you brought this issue up. Did any of you not consent for your information to go straight to your provider? Did everyone consent for that information to be shared? What about the biobank? Did you all 4 consent for your information to be shared to the biobank? The recontact for future research opportunities and that sort of thing? Yeah.
So,
yeah. So that kind of, you know, compared to the data that Dr. Korf showed earlier, y'all are in a little bit of a minority, having all 4 of you consent to share that with your provider, but it sounds like you didn't really think about it until later. So let me ask, I'll ask one more question of the group, and then I'll kind of open it up. I have a couple of others here, though, if we need some more ideas. For the 3 of you that have received your results, what were your initial thoughts at the time of result disclosure, and what, if anything, could the AGHI have done to better kind of support you through that initial process?
I'll go ahead and jump in. So as I said, I was going through this process at the same time as my wife. So it was interesting that I believe my wife got her results well in advance of me. So I knew, and we tested at the same time. So there was this question of, okay, what's going on here? So there was a little bit of anxiety in knowing that there was something maybe anomalous with my results. I just didn't know what. And I can't remember now the lag between when my wife found out her results and when I found out mine. But there was that initial just kind of red flag that there was probably something going on. And then during, I think the other part during my experience was that I don't pick up the phone anymore. Just too much junk calls coming in. So you get this voicemail saying, you know, please call me back. We would like to, I'm from the study. We'd like to talk about your results. So it's like, oh, okay. No, it's sort of more confirmation that there's something going on with my results. And so again, a little more anxiety. I thought the genetic counselor did a great job actually of describing what the issues were. But one other thing I think, you know, the takeaway for me during that time was that, well, you need to go talk to your primary care provider, or you need to go talk to a physician to get more information about this and find out what you can do, if anything, and find out if this is really an issue for you. For me, the challenge is that I can't get into my primary care physician. I have one, but it's 3 to 6 months. So I'm sitting there. I was fortunate in that I work in healthcare. I have good connections, a network that allows me to identify, in this case, a cardiologist. I was able to get in quickly, but you know, if that were not the case, that's the kind of the concern, access to care for those who want. But again, that was sort of my experience of kind of getting those results and kind of what ensued after that.
I think for me, getting the results was not a problem. But can I make one side note here?
Sure.
Is that for me, I wouldn't have taken the study if it wasn't to have the branding of UAB behind it. So for me, It was about the brand of who was doing it. I know I've been hearing people talk about, the trust. I trusted UAB. I trust my wife, but if she would have told me some name I didn't know, I wouldn't have made the time to go. So I just wanted to say that up front. It was because of UAB that I did go. Now, that question was you was asking?
Just asking, when you received your results, if there were any particular concerns or reactions that you had right off the bat, anything that the AGHI could have supported you.
Same as what what's your name?
Participant 3.
I'm joking. I thought we said it comes 3. The same as number 3 here said. For me, it was my wife got her results back, but I can say about the people who actually did the testing that they gave me the time frame. I think it was 2 to 3 months. I think it was something like that. So long as it didn't go outside of that time frame, I was not worried. Now, if it would have went outside that time frame, I probably have been worried. But my wife did come back first. She was good. But mine came back, I think, like 2 or 3 weeks later, so I didn't have a problem with it.
When I received the results, my situation was a little bit different than everyone else's on the panel. I had just come back from the doctor with some blood work and answered the phone, got my results, and I was kind of awed because just 3-4 weeks before that, I had made contact with a blood relative that I had never made contact with before. And over about 2-week period, had found out that there were some heart issues on that side of the family. And my potential, we still don't know, but my potential biological father had been diagnosed with a heart issue, and his entire family had been told they needed to be checked. Go to the cardiologist, be checked for this. And I mean, seriously, within 2 weeks, I get a phone call saying, explaining this to me and telling me that I have the marker for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And I was just kind of overwhelmed, I think, because those 2 incidences occurring so close together. So definitely a little anxiety there, a little stress. Having just come from my doctor's appointment, they followed up with me like the next day on something. And I said, hey, by the way, and so I actually got in to see a cardiologist within 2 weeks, which I'm told is very rare. And I'm fine. Okay. But the one thing that I will note, the person who called me, and I do not remember his name, he was very thorough in explaining to me what it meant, and that even if I was not diagnosed, or even if I did not have it, that my children would need to be tested. Strongly, adamant about that. So that is something we have not done yet because both my children are in college. But it is definitely a source of anxiety because I'm clear, but that does not mean that they aren't.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience now that I've had a chance to? He's coming with a mic.
Hi, my question is for participant number 4. Given the fact that that was a 13-page consent form, when we went through that consent form with you, can you tell me, and I know you said earlier that you had no concerns, and it's a very thorough and in-depth consent and process. At any time, I mean, did you understand, was everything clear? Every category about your benefits, confidentiality, the GINA law, was that all clear to you?
I think when you guys went through it with me, I'm going to say probably 85 to 90% of everything you said was very clear. Now, some things I probably didn't understand, that because it was a long process. So I'm not going to say like I knew everything you was talking about. But again, it's because my wife, and then it was the atmosphere of UAB. I trusted you guys. So what I did know, I trusted what you were saying was up legit.
Hi, so 2 questions. One is, how did you feel? So we spent a lot of time today talking about return of results, but we also felt like, or what sort of came up was, once you had your results turned, you were left on your own to go out and sort of figure that out, with your your patient provider. So you're in a study. So I'm sort of recapping this for the group. You're in a study, but now you're left to sort of deal with that and return to your clinician. And so there's a gap there, right? There's a gap in clinical care. So my first question is, how do you feel about that? How is that sort of perceived from a patient perspective? Is there anything that could be done better from a study perspective to sort of bridge those gaps between between a study such as this, but then also being, transitioning to an actionable sort of situation in clinical care? And then the next question I'll have, and this is again for anyone on the panel, how do you feel about your data or your genomic being included in larger sort of aggregate studies where other researchers, I'm a genomic researcher, where we would aggregate that and make, sort of broad spanning sort of determinations about global health, not individual to you, but just your data being included with large other data sets where we would go in and try to find new, markers or so forth. And how do you guys feel about, your data being deposited or analyzed that way?
To answer your first question, I actually did find it somewhat challenging to get an appointment to see a cardiologist. My mother had a heart condition. She passed away from congestive heart failure. So I did know of a cardiologist in town. So I reached out to her first and found, it was going to take a while and I had to get a letter from my physician and everything. So when I spoke to my physician, she wanted to see the write-up from the Alabama Genomic Health Initiative. And from there, she finally, after talking with me at length, she was willing to schedule an appointment. The cardiologist that I saw was very interested in that. She wanted to see the write-up for her report, and she actually pulled it out and started going over every line and explaining everything about it. But it was just not knowing how to get that appointment. Because when I first called, the cardiologist that I did know, they would not see me, unless I came through a referral, and that was challenging. So it would have been nice to have maybe a referral.
I haven't gotten my results yet, so I don't know how this is going to go for me, but perhaps AGHI in future could possibly assist with getting these reference letters or initiating or identifying certain groups or organizations that would be willing to see patients under these circumstances. As she said, she needed a letter from her physician, so obviously she probably would still need that, but I know at UAB there's a number of groups that do similar, that they have pretty much every kind of doctor you could imagine. So perhaps even just a list of names at UAB that if the patients wish to discuss with a UAB doctor, great. And if they would prefer to go to their primary care physician and find a different name or discuss with someone else, then obviously that's their right as well. But maybe the AGHI could assist with identifying physicians for whatever condition they have, be it cancer is or a heart condition, a cardiologist.
Yeah, I agree with panelists 1 and 2 that the transition or the sort of the continuity piece from the study to your primary care provider or whatever physician you need to see is kind of is key here, because for the reasons I think panelist 1 as well as my own experience, that you're left to sort of seek out a provider to discuss these issues in more depth. And it's not always the case they can get in a timely manner. And that's a systemic issue. That's not a study issue. This is, I'm not sure there's an easy fix to this. If there were, we would, many of us wouldn't have jobs probably. So I do think, being able to help study participants bridge that gap, whether that's a referral, whether that's just a document that outlines or describes the issue in more depth, so that you can initiate that conversation with a healthcare provider more easily, I think would go a long way toward making that transition a little more seamless. To your second question, I personally don't have a problem with my information being shared in larger studies. I think this is one of the the sort of the great benefits of a study like this, as well as sort of the growth in all these computing power and all we have, these things we have for doing research like this. So I sort of knew that going in, or I suspected that was the case going in, and I would be in full support of my information being used in other studies.
I concur pretty much with what everyone here said, especially when it comes to my information being used on a broader stage. I think in the Black community, we have to make sure that, you know, Black men don't like going to the hospital. That's just, you know, something that's unknown. And so reason why when I found out and understood what this was all about, you know, more people, people need to be able to see people like myself going to actually do this, because you guys can't find a cure if you don't know that there's a problem. So I think, you know, for me, in general, and the people I've always been talking to them, like, you know, if there's a test, and the biggest thing I've seen when it comes to testing is we don't mind giving the test. We just don't want people to be, you know, sticking needles in us and putting something inside of us, but giving blood for somebody to test. I think most people are probably okay with that.
The only thing I would sort of add to that or amend my statement is that, you know, when this data is used for other research purposes, I'm in full support. I think I mentioned earlier, when there was any sort of concerns about the use of data is when it's released outside of the study to my healthcare provider, for example, to the extent that healthcare providers now and my health insurer may now be aware of this. How does that affect my premiums, other things? So it's not the researchers that's my concern. It's when that data goes beyond what all of you would be using those data for. So.
Did the two of you want a chance to answer the question about data?
Yeah, I agree with panelists 3 and 4. I was not at all concerned about my data being used for other research purposes.
I'm agreeing with everyone. One of the primary reasons I joined the study was actually because I was aware that it's a useful source of data for researchers. I myself am a researcher, so I understand the need for sample size. And so that was one of the primary reasons. Obviously, my own curiosity about my own health also supported the desire to join the project. But I knew that my data was going to be used, and that's why I was fine with sharing it to the research community for this purpose.
Hi, I just want to say thank you all for sharing your experiences and perspectives with us. It's been very valuable. I have 2 questions. My first question is, what value did you get from your return of results, or how valuable were they for you? And are you interested in other types of results, things like ancestry or risk for non-medically actionable diseases, or even your raw data? Would that be something you're interested in receiving? And then my second question had to do with the scope. So I know a few of you took the test with your spouse or shared it with your children, but did you contact anyone else in your family, any siblings, or did you tell your children if you had them and did it with your spouse? So what was the scope of sharing your results with your family or even friends, anyone important in your life?
Your second question's on my mind. I did share my results with my family, with my children, who do not know that I am adopted yet. But that had, you know, my results had really had no bearing on being adopted. So I did share those results with them. I cannot now think of what your first question was. Would you mind?
Yes, I was asking about the value for the results that you did receive. So what value you got from receiving those results, and if you'd be interested in other types of results, like ancestry information or risk for non-medically actionable genes.
Well, I, for one, in my circumstances, having been adopted, would definitely be interested in sharing those results. I would be interested in getting as much data as I could. I am not actively seeking my biological parents. I had great parents who raised me, and I'm fine with that. But I do have 2 children, and so from their perspective, as much information as I could get. I mean, if growing up in a family with your parents, you already know when you have a cousin who's got Alzheimer's or an aunt who's got cancer and so forth. I don't have that.
Yeah, I shared my information. I have two brothers. I shared it with both my brothers. My children are not old enough at this point in time to understand what any of this means, but it would certainly be my intention as they get older to share that information with them. In retrospect, yeah, I actually found the information quite valuable. I'm glad I went through the process. Again, in retrospect, maybe that's because after seeing the cardiologist and having everything checked out, it checked out okay. But the other part of your question is for whether I'd want more results, particularly non-modifiable factors. I think my personal preference is no. I think this was actually one of the reasons I agreed to participate in the studies was because these were modifiable factors. And if the results included more, they were more comprehensive and included non-modifiable, I think I would have been more reluctant to participate under those circumstances.
And just let me interject, I actually would like to have more. And I was in here earlier, and I believe, Nakana, I believe Dr. Nakana had mentioned in one of her slides that you could request and fill out a form to get more information. I'm like all over that. So.
For me, of course, if there's more information, I don't have a problem with getting the information. And did I find the test very valuable? Yes, I did. It was very valuable.
And participant 2, you may not be able to comment on the value, but is that extra information something that you would have been interested in at the point of consenting?
At the time, I was mostly focused on the the modifiable health issues within the scope of the current project. But in the future, I may very well come back and request more data, and I definitely would be interested in, like as you said, knowing your own raw data. I would love to see that, but that's also the scientist in me. So.
Okay. Hi, I'm sorry. I know you, did you want to go before me? Okay. I'm Nancy Murner. I'm from Auburn University. And I do cancer genetics right now, but I noticed on the list of the panel that your study screened for was a gene that I actually was involved in the discovery with in 2008, TMEM43 for ARVC, which is arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy. So cardiomyopathies, heart disease, near and dear to my heart. It made me the researcher I am today because it enabled my group to develop a patent, actually save lives because we can implant a defibrillator, which is things that you were looking for and hoping for if these mutations were identified. My question, though, is to participants 1 and 3 who have these results. You have a risk variant. Fortunately, both of you went to your physicians and you have no symptoms of disease right now. I am curious, and I know genetics is a complicated subject. It's not you have the mutation, you have the disease. It's penetrance, it's risk. So now you are at risk of having these cardiac symptoms. How well do you understand that? Do you understand with age that your risk may increase? Do you understand like you have children? What is the earliest age of onset for the mutation that you were given? Were you exposed to these details, whether it be through genetic counseling or through your cardiologist? Do you know that range and the chances of having these symptoms based on age?
I would like to say that I do know. I know that my cardiologist was very thorough. She pointed out that my children are just over 18, and she pointed out that they had been tested before that it would not really have been valid for them. And so she recommended, now that they're at 18, that we go ahead and get that done. At my age, she said that, and I hope this is accurate, she did say that at my age, if I had it, it more than likely would have started showing up before now. I'd like to say that's true, and I hope y'all agree, and if not, then I need to know, I guess. So there you
go. My situation, I think, is similar to panelist 1. My cardiologist was very thorough. The genetic counselor, I believe, was very thorough. Some of these issues that you've described, I recall coming up, but I could not tell you the details of this. This was a year ago. So I think that kind of speaks more to the issue that even if you do communicate these things in a conversation with the genetic counselor or your physician, that information just doesn't stick always. You don't remember it a year later. And it again speaks to this issue of continuity of care, being able to somehow have that conversation on a repeated basis with your physician or cardiologist, assuming you have this sustained relationship with them. Can't guarantee that if I were to move and switch physicians that, you know, this conversation is going to be happening every year. I already have an appointment scheduled with my cardiologist, you know, on a regular basis to kind of hopefully continue to have these conversations so that I can be reminded that these risk factors are going to increase with age and other things. But again, I couldn't tell you the details of those conversations at this point in time 9 months ago.
And I will say that my cardiologist did not want to see me back for 10 years. So.
Again, thank you all for sharing your insight and your stories. This has been a really invaluable session. So my question is specifically for panelists 4. So you mentioned that you were not aware of genomics-based studies before this encounter with UAB. So I'm wondering, my question is about engagement. Where are places and spaces that we can engage people who are unaware of this types of research to have this dialogue with community members? And my second question is, you mentioned that you had this trusting perspective of UAB, but unfortunately that's not everyone's perspectives related, not just to UAB, but just institutions in general. Mm-hmm. So how might we engage those people who are less likely to participate in genomic studies, if you have any ideas about that?
The best way I can explain is first the trust factor is when I lived overseas. Well, I'll take Magic Johnson, for example. Magic Johnson, when he did movie theaters, okay? When he did movie theaters in the urban community, he put different things inside the movie theater, like Kool-Aid and called popcorn, different names. So I think when we go into the trust factor, I think we have to make sure in communities that is relatable to the different communities that you're speaking to. I was speaking to someone here earlier when they said 23andMe is called. That's more relatable than what is the one here? Right, that I'm just making fun, but I'm saying if you told me that, it sounds foreign. So if you come into my community to talk to me about that, it sounds like it's something difficult and I don't trust you. But if you said 23andMe, right, and I'm not telling you guys what to do, but I'm just saying if you said 23andMe, it's more relatable. So if you kind of took that name and probably gave it also known as and put it in different communities, you know, I think it'll go over a lot easier, because no matter if you're talking to a community leader, a pastor, or a doctor there, if you're saying those letters to the urban community, they're not going to trust you because they have no idea what it means. So I'm going to shut down immediately. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
And you was asking, what was the other question?
So I was just, well, you pretty much answered.
Okay.
You were talking about the networks and other places that you might engage people who are unaware of. If you have ideas about.
I think the biggest thing is making sure that the people that you're talking to, the community leaders, the pastor, whoever you're working with, to make sure that they understand how to communicate what you're trying to say. Because I listen to everybody, it's very passionate what you're saying, and you know your subject matter very well, but it's not my emergency. So when you're talking to me, I don't really hear what you're saying because you're saying words to me that don't really register. I understand you, but it don't register to me today. And so when you're saying these different core values and all these different things you're saying to me, the person that's sitting down in front of you, make sure they understand your message so they can disseminate it to the other people, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that.
I had one question that would apply to all 4 of you, backing up a little bit, but since we are talking about return of results, a couple of you brought up the idea of the timeline of receiving your results. You said, I believe it was you, participant 4, that said that if you had gone past that 2 to 3 month window and had not received anything, you would have gotten concerned. You mentioned that you knew something was up because your wife got yours far in advance of when you did. So I'd like to hear, and we have someone here that's waiting on his results. I'd like to hear if there's anything that maybe could have gone more smoothly about that process of waiting, if you had any particular anxiety of wondering what's going on with your sample, why is it taking so long, why did my wife get hers back before mine, why should it take longer to test if there's a result. If there would have been room for improvement on the communication of what was happening during that time.
Yeah, I'll start here. So, again, in fairness to the consent and the details provided in that consent process, it may have been described, but again, I think we talked about the fact that this is a lengthy consent process. There's a lot of information thrown at you. So, again, a couple of months later, when I'm waiting for results, it's not as though I remember those details, or I'm going to pull out the consent and look at this and say, well, is the delay within that window of you might expect just from a testing standpoint. But so I don't know that there's something that could have been done differently. I'd have to think about that more. But so yeah, I don't have any specific recommendations to say I think if you'd done this differently, other than to somehow, if it's not in the consent process, make it clear that there is that window.
I think I had a benefit over them is I did not do it with a spouse who received results before me. About maybe 3 months after I had done the test, I kind of remembered that I'd done the test. And that was about the time that I had made contact with a blood relative. And so all of that was kind of in my mind. But I trusted UAB to get those to me, hopefully in 4 months. After the 4-month mark, I was going to, get a little concerned.
Do you have any thoughts while you're waiting on your results?
I just know this is no rapid strep test. You don't just drop the blood sample in a vial and get the results 5 minutes later. It's going to take days and weeks to get true results, and depending on how many people had signed up before me or around the same time as me could influence the amount of time it takes to get to my specific sample. So I'm not at all concerned about the amount of time I've waited so far.
And one thought that I have heard some participants just anecdotally mention that there are some of the direct-to-consumer offerings that will do some sort of sample tracking. Like if you log in, it might say, they're working on it in the lab, they're working on the report, they're in kind of that tracking system. And so I don't know or think that that would necessarily be something that would be able to be done within the AGHI, but for future study design, if perhaps that would help with engagement, to have that over time. You've got this 2 or 3 month window where you're not hearing anything, if that would be something that participants would be interested in, or if that would have made any difference to any of you.
For me, it wouldn't have, because like I said, it wasn't my emergency. Because my wife had me to go do it. So
it's her emergency.
It was hers. But honestly, when we did it, I think it was just something she wanted to see, could she get me to do, number one. Honestly, because when she said something about bio, I'm like, what? But anyway, we went and we did it. So for me, it wasn't. For me, I think what we're saying here, when I'm looking at my wife and when I went there, it was more so that I went alone just to make my wife happy in the beginning. So
I almost think that it was probably good that I wasn't so focused on getting the results. If I had had the ability to track, I know me, I would have been tracking it every day. And I think that might have lent itself to more anxiety for myself.
Yeah, I agree. It was after the testing, honestly, it was sort of out of sight, out of mind for several months. And it was only when my wife got her results that it just kind of popped in my head, like, oh yeah, we did this a while back. So, so in my case may have been such an exception that you probably shouldn't put too much into it. But so yeah, I agree. I'm not sure the tracking system would have changed my perspective on that timeline.
I honestly, the tracking system really wouldn't influence my participation, or wouldn't have. And honestly, I don't know if I don't know. Sometimes, you get a FedEx package and you can track it and it says it's en route or it's in this location. Sometimes I wonder if those are truly accurate. So whether it'll
say, good point, though. How would we make sure that's accurate?
It'll say it's in Florida and I'll get it the next day, or otherwise it'll say it's in Birmingham and then it will still be 3 weeks before I actually get the package. So is it truly where they're saying it is? Whether or not, I would assume that the AGHI would be honest with their result steps, but I don't know if it would really improve my desire to join in the project, just because I don't truly know if they are where they say they are, and if they have to stop and log, okay, now we're at this step. It's just taking time away from them getting me the results. I don't need to know that information until I have the final results.
And I think we have a couple more questions, maybe right here on the front, or Rini?
I think they were first. Okay, real quick. So related to that, in terms of that workflow of that CLIA validation, so we have a variant and then we send it off for the validation, and we know that's going to take a couple more weeks. We hope only a few weeks, but sometimes it's up to the lab. Would it create more anxiety for you, or would you want to know where you were in that process if somebody in your household received those results and you didn't? Would you want us to give you a phone call and say, want to let you know that your results are still being validated, and be transparent about what is going on, knowing that, okay, it may not validate, and then then you receive that negative result and you think, wait a minute, what did you see that didn't validate? Is there more to that? Any thoughts on whether or not you'd want to be receive that transparent of information, or would you rather just wait for the result?
I mean, personally, excuse me, I think I would rather wait for the result. I think knowing that there was like, again, there was samples being sent out for validation would just sort of move that anxiety period up even a little more, and give me something, I think, in a sense, more concrete to be anxious about. It's sort of the unknown in this case was, it sort of raised some suspicions, but the fact that there was less information produced less anxiety, if that makes sense. So I think knowing more would have just triggered more anxiety for me in my scenario.
So I have a question about the visits to the cardiologist and insurance coverage. Was that covered by insurance, and then therefore then that would be, that information would be provided to the insurance providers? And then what is the risk of then that being used against people in the future, that they've got this condition or anything like that? That's one of my concerns about it.
My appointment was covered by insurance. Sorry, was covered by insurance. I guess I'm just not real concerned, about future coverage, because I've got enough already to deal with. So, it's not, I don't think it's going to make it where they'll reject me or anything like that. And I could be being very naive, I don't know.
Mine was also covered. I don't know, to be honest, how much detail is given to the health insurance company to say, whether they would be able to clearly identify what was the underlying cause for the EKG, for example. They're billing for an EKG, but so I just don't know how much detail the health insurer is getting. It clearly resides somewhere in in the EMR, and it's floating around the system, and so it's out there. But so I don't have great concern at this point in time. If for some reason I were to switch, to move, to change insurers, things like that, and there was a need for that information to be made more apparent, then I think that would be more concerning for me. But right now, I guess I'm not real concerned that information is going to be known to my insurer or changed.
And just to remind everybody, for GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, the current protections that are in place are that the health insurers cannot use that to deny coverage, raise premiums, that sort of thing. Where we worry is supplemental insurances, long-term care, life, disability. When those applications are made and medical records are reviewed, those protections don't exist for those same insurances. So that would be of concern, were they to gather that information or ask questions on the form, then you're either committing insurance fraud or letting them, whatever the way of gathering information is.
I have a general question, whether this whole process has made you more thinking about your own health and future from a medical perspective, or whether it hasn't really changed your perspective on that. Are you, I think all of you have heard that the absence of actionable information doesn't mean that you're in the clear for all the things that all of us have as potential health risks going forward. But has this encounter with the system made you more aware of the uncertainty of the future and given you more concern, or has it given you some degree of comfort?
I think for myself, I thought I knew, you know, from family history, you know, the various illnesses that I had the potential for getting, you know, cancers, heart conditions, and so forth. Finding out I was adopted at such a late age kind of put a blank slate. I mean, I can remember going in for to a gastroenterologist for a colonoscopy, and him asking me, and this was my second one I'd had, and him asking me some questions. And I said, well, I have just found out that I'm adopted. And he goes, oh, really? He said, so you're not related to your father? And I was like, no. And he goes, well, then I'll see you in 10 years instead of 5. You know, so I mean, it was like such a blank slate of not knowing. Now, when I did tell my father that, his was like, well, I'm glad that you had these tests because you were being proactive. Well, I didn't need them, you know. So now, having done this genetics testing, I know that, oh yeah, I do have a potential for a heart condition. Well, that's what I thought I had growing up my whole time. So that really didn't change anything for me.
I think for me, I found more comfort. I know we're tight on time, but my father had cancer. So even though he had the cancer, I did not take it serious because I'm like, it can't happen to me, right? And even though I know that was, he told me to go get checked, I did go get checked that one time, but I didn't go back because they didn't find anything. I was supposed to get checked, I think, every year when I do my physical, and I didn't. But when my wife brought this back to my attention, that came back to the forefront for me because I'm like, I'm young, I don't feel anything. And so I think it helped more so for me to make me feel comfortable, knowing that something was out there that I needed to do. And I think, you know, a lot of us, especially men, we need to let our ego go and we need to take our behinds to the hospital.
Like the other panelists, overall, I think my experience was positive, and I would do it over again if given the choice. Particularly, again, going back to this idea that these were modifiable factors, thinking about kind of the counterfactual, if for some reason things didn't check out, there are things that I could and should be doing now to make sure that you know, I reduce the risk of any sort of cardiac incidents down the road. So armed with that information, I could have done other things. And even now, I mean, knowing just that I need to continue to monitor these things, that just because I don't have it now, that doesn't mean that I couldn't develop this later. Again, I think that's good information, and I would prefer to have that. So despite any sort of concerns I may have expressed about the process or any anxiety, you know, those were, I think, minor in comparison to what I think the benefits were for me.
I want to preface this concluding discussion session by saying to you that, as you well know, practicing bioethics holistically starts with good facts. And I don't mean alternative facts. I mean good facts, even when good ethics does not always lead, or let me back up a minute, even when good facts does not always lead to good ethics. So you saw the demonstration of that right here before your own very eyes. Dr. Kov presented some interesting and important facts about AGHI. Dr. Nakano came around and gave appropriate bioethical issues involved. And then we spent some time listening to those who have had or are having or even yet to have what we call lived experiences. So we have a rich knowledge now to sort of participate in this concluding session that I am going to invite you to bring out your cell phone, or so if you can bring out your cell phone, and we want to get your responses on two of our objectives, objective number 3 and objective number 4. Objective number 3, if you remember, had to do with culture of trust and trustworthiness amongst our collaborating institutions and those that are volunteering for research. In order to create this response, I need for you to text, if you have your cell phone, to this address, 22333, text CCTS Bioethic 928 is right here on the. So you're texting to 22333. That's your address. The message you send is CCTS Bioethic 928, no space. You should get a message. Did you get a message? All right. You should get a message, and then it will say you can test. So I want you to imagine a culture of trust and trustworthiness among at UAB and among other our collaborating institutions, and just think about 2 words that you want to use to describe, that comes to your mind to describe that kind of culture of trust and trustworthiness. Yeah, people online, are you with us? All right, you are welcome to participate in this with us. If you've been listening in, please participate in this with us. Get out your cell phone, and in the message box, type 22333. And then the message is CCTS BIOETHIC 928, no space. You should get a message, and after that message, you can give us an idea of, if you imagine a culture of trust and trustworthiness at UAB or any of our partnering institutions, and our volunteers of research, what 2 words come to mind? You can send that. We're already getting perspectives in, words in. Okay, more. Okay. Are we ready to have a little discussion of the data? Are we got in? Okay, there's still some more coming in. All right. I would strongly encourage you not to chew and speak at the same time, because I don't want us to choke on our food. But if you can, what seems to be here the major word that will be extremely important as we figure out what a culture of trust and trustworthiness would look like at UAB or any of our other institutions, so far as our mission here is concerned. What seems to be the picture that we have here? Given the picture that what's the largest, most is changing, so perhaps some people are still trying to log in. All right. The boldest and the biggest letter are, help me out here now.
Respect.
Respect. And that seems to undergird all of these other things, right? But right next to that is what?
Truth.
Right
Transparency.
next to that is truth. It looks like that's, well, and right next to truth is communications, would you say? Communications, does transparency go before communication? It looks like from here, maybe I'm not reading it right. So we have respect, number one. Number two, people are interested in the truth. Just tell the truth, right? Say what you know and say what you don't know. The thing about, I've always thought that the thing about even trying to validate or interpret genetic results is probabilistic. Probabilistic issues means that there is some level of uncertainty there. So it's important for us to let those that are participating know what we do know and what we can sort of just hedge on that we're not so sure about. So bring them in to be part of the building of the knowledge base that is necessary. Community caught my attention. Did it catch yours too? Is a community, right? Is that, what does that suggest to us? That all of us here, right? I'll give you a hint. All of us here know that this thing that we're trying to do, the information, the knowledge base, goes beyond the individual, right? Okay, we saw it demonstrated in the lived experiences that we engaged in just a while ago. And not only that, something concerning about the value that is returned to the community from which that individual may have come. That's also important. Anything else that strikes you as paramount here? We got respect, we got truth, we got communication, we got transparency, and we got community. What else would you say? Yes. Honesty.
Engagement and expectations.
Honesty, engagement, expectations. So it would be interesting, wouldn't it, to try to rank order these things based on their the way, the sizes of the letter and the vividness with which it comes to us. That is not to say that all the other words there that you all supplied are not important, right? They are important, but if we were to rank order, I think respect will work for number one. Truth might be next. Communication might be next. Transparency, community, honesty, engagement, expectations. Then we got all the other ones as well. Well, if we can imagine this, because we ought to be able to imagine something before we can make it happen, it prompts us as to what then can we do? What are practical steps that one can take within our various communities, community of researchers, institutional, community, communities, citizens, communities, what can we do? And that's the next question. Mr. Wallace, can we take a picture of this so we can have it for next time? And then we can move on to the next question. So while we are getting that, okay, this next question, and we will go through the same kind of thing, text the message to 22333, and the message is CCTS, Bioethics 928. And the question is, as you think about practical steps for promoting trust and trustworthiness, given the picture that we had just a while ago of our imagination, what two words come to your mind in what should we do? Practical steps in our collaborating institutions and even amongst ourselves, okay, as individuals, as moral agents. Give us two words that come to your mind. Okay, do we have more coming in still? All right. Should we take a peek at what's prominent here? Okay. So it seems to me, help me out here too, that what seems to be prominent here is the word communication. Are you surprised? Yeah, I'm not, because the idea of trust and trustworthiness does not happen in vacuum. Oh, it disappeared. Now we are looking at follow through. Okay. And I don't know what place communication has taken, but the idea of trust and trustworthiness does not happen in a vacuum, right? Those of us that are married know that communication is always the key. Communication or miscommunication. But the idea of follow through is also quite important. I would say follow through means integrity as well, right? Say what you want to do and do what you said you want to do. Okay, things are still sort of changing. Maybe people are still thinking, but I picked on multi-level for one to do follow through, multi-level impact. It struck me as we were listening to the lived experiences that panelist number one had a good opportunity to connect real quickly with a health professional that could assist. But are scores of people who might not be able to do that. Would it make sense to put in place something that can actually make it easier for people to be able to have this access? But I know that as soon as I've said that, we're thinking about resources. What resources do we have to do that? So we really do need to think about that. So all I've said is to say this. And I'll say it because as I was looking at the literature, 3 people in consecutive years, 3 commentators in consecutive years, broached the idea of structural competency and structural humility. In other words, have a sense of what's going on around us and what we can do in order to affect the lives of others who are not necessarily having the same kind of health equity that we might be able to command. It's a structural competency calls for a new approach to the relationship among race, class, and symptom expression. It bridges research on social determinants of health to clinical interventions and prepares clinical trainees to act on systemic causes of health inequities. Metzler and Hansen in 2014, Kengori in 2015, and Kerasiodo in 2017 actually called our attention to that. So we need to understand what's available in the system or in the environment that we are and how they can assist. What we need to do differently and what we need to do to encourage the realization of what you call a culture of trust and trustworthiness. Well, you know what? Communication has come back to be number one here. And then, of course, follow through is there. Other thoughts? Other thoughts? Yes, sir. Dr. Koff.
What occurs to me as I see this set of words, and actually it occurred to me on the previous slide as well, is that, for example, if you take transparency, which had emerged as a major issue the first time around, and communication here, when you really think about it, take AGHI. We're transparent, but not about everything. And in fact, a point was made by one of the panelists that there were things that would have preferred, and well, actually, they were not unhappy that we weren't totally transparent. So what I mean by that is, transparency means to me you don't hide anything. And we don't hide anything. But as you heard, we don't give real-time updates on where your results are. And full transparency might include that you could always look and see, to the minute where your sample was. And partly we don't do it, I'd say, because the resources that it would take to make that really work are substantial. But one could argue that actually, and I think one of the panelists did argue, that that's not even a good thing to have that much transparency, that to some extent it's almost better to give your sample and forget about it. And then when the time comes, it resurfaces. So although the word transparency seems like a good thing, it's nuanced. It's not really total transparency because not everybody even wants it. Communication could be the same thing. You want to know that you're communicating relevant information to participants and to the community, but there is such a thing as too much communication, where people get badgered with information they don't ask for, aren't interested in, and that actually you could lose people in the noise, right? You could give so much that they stop paying attention to you and figure that this is just another bit of spam. And so I guess I'm getting to the point that, as useful as these words are, things are much more nuanced than might seem on the surface, which could be something worth thinking about for future sessions. Is what do we mean by transparency? What do we mean by communication? How much is enough? How much is too much? What's the sweet spot for all of these goals?
I think that's a great observation. Let me suggest that because within the AGHI, we are giving the options to participants. When you say you want me to be transparent, to what extent? What do you want me to be transparent about? Yeah. So that fits into the nuance. Communication. How much do you want to know? So far as I know, we give that option. within the AGHI. Do you want to know at all? You know, research participants have a right not to know. They do. So it won't be a surprise if somebody says, I don't want to know, I don't care. Okay, but that will be a very small percentage of people that would express it that way. And we must respect their decision not to know, or to know this much, or that much, or that much, right? So yes, I'm in agreement with you, Dr. Koff. Well, actually, your comment leads to the next forum series, right? Did we take a picture of this? You took a picture of it. Let me see the slides. I think it's the my final slide there that has something on it that says, Future Bioethics Forum, where should we go from here?